Welcome back to the Data Driven Strength Podcast. Today, on episode 7 of season 2, we're going to be mixing things up a little bit. We're going to join the very cool YouTube trend of doing a tier list, but we're going to put our own little spin on it here. We're going to be taking. Josh took me through. I forget the exact context of the one that we did last time. Was it just variables for strength?
Yeah, we were discussing the impact of frequency on strength gains, and then I was just like, screw it, let's just do a tier list.
Yeah, okay.
And very stupidly chose to do it on a 1, 2, 3 basis instead of like a grading system.
Proper.
So, yeah, we're going to do the tier list our own way. But I think just to be transparent, this isn't what we planned to initially talk about today, because we're really slow playing getting to the effects of strength on the effects of volume on strength, and also kind of how that may matter or may not matter for hypertrophy. Any thoughts on that or anything you want to say about that?
I mean, it's just, we realize that's probably, like, we're trying to give that topic due justice, ultimately, is that it could be
we could have let it rip a while ago.
Could have just done the final episode of the kind of the interpretation series on the
dose response.
The dose response meta-analysis. But that topic has been, gotten a lot of press on social media, and we're trying to
not be flippant with it.
Yeah, exactly.
Because it's easy to be flippant with it.
It's easy to be flippant with it. It's easy to be very dismissing of opinions that people have. But I think, we always try to take the position of like, what's the steelman, the opposition ultimately is like, what is the kernel of truth that this view is trying to deliver from all sides, and try to, combine those things when we speak about things. And I think that's ultimately what we're trying to do with that topic, and try to be a little bit more broad sweeping with the way we're attacking it. So we're taking our time with it, and eventually that'll be a good episode. But right now we're going to take a little bit of a detour and have some fun.
I think scientists, or just like people that value evidence and science in general, are probably more aware than the average person about like the possibility of having blind spots in their interpretation of things. But I think that even folks that are evidence-based and kind of recognize that and are aware of confirmation bias, they're not immune to it. Maybe this is something we'll talk about in a future episode, but I've been trying to take some steps to keep myself honest with some things in my life recently, or probably a better way to say that is, how do I kind of view things from the outside looking in as if I was advising someone else?
Sure.
Or like, how is something so straightforward and seemingly pretty easy to suggest to a client, whereas when it's with yourself, you start like overthinking it, or you start kind of like coming to weird conclusions, or kind of missing the forest for the trees, et cetera. So it's a long way of saying I think that there's probably blind spots for everyone, including us. And
it's part of being human.
Yeah. But I don't really know where I was going with that. I think I was just trying to point out that we were trying to not be flippant with it. And to be frank, got some other stuff going on, so it can be hard to put in the the amount of time that's necessary to get that ready to rock, and we didn't want to rush it. So even if we get that to you a year after the data set was pre-printed, then so be it. I guess we'll take that trade-off. But that'll probably be coming relatively soon. So for now, this is kind of like a filler episode, and you'll have to excuse us today because not a whole lot of prep went into it, and it'll just
sometimes that's where the best episodes come from.
Yeah. So hey, especially for something I've been thinking about recently is like OG data driven strength listeners. Yeah. Talking 2020.
Sure.
COVID. I have like my girlfriend at the time, now my fiance. Her mom cutting my hair during COVID. I'm like, I'm like, what's going on with my hair?
Yeah.
I like tried growing out the beard.
Yeah.
It looked terrible.
Yeah.
Those episodes, right?
Mm-hmm.
People that are still with us from then. And then now we have some folks that are just, I guess, newer.
Yep.
And it's definitely different. So what I'm getting at here is, if you're an OG, especially if you're an OG, let us know what you think of the filler episode with a little bit less prep, a little bit less figures, a little bit more tier lists.
Yeah, sweet. Yeah, I'm trying to think of as a final intro piece. Is there anything in the exercise science ticker on in the social media world that's been interesting recently? I'm trying to think if anything is.
I've done a good job of spending less time on the internet recently.
So have I. I've been, like, yeah, man. I've spent significantly less time like keeping up with like I normally do. We've just been insanely busy. I think both of us have just been really busy. But yeah, I try to keep a pulse because I do think I do think that's important because I think ultimately some of the reason we do what we do is to try to communicate things that people actually are engaging with and like struggling with or like talking about. But I'm trying to think of anything.
I've been okay. Another reason you'll have to excuse me is that I had a really rough travel day a couple days ago. So I started in a Midwestern state. My flight left from another Midwestern state, so I had to drive from Midwest State A to Midwest State B. Next thing you know, it was 75 degrees 24 hours before I started that drive. I'm sorry, like whatever, 36 hours. A couple days before, it was 75 degrees. We start that drive at 6:30 in the morning. Next thing you know, we're driving 25 miles per hour behind a Target semi-truck on the highway because it's snowing. And then our flight's delayed 5 hours, and then our flight gets diverted. So I'm still, recovering from that a little bit. Still have to excuse us on that front. But the reason I bring that up is, while I had all that additional time, knocked out some work, I was also listening to some podcasts. And what I noticed I was gravitating towards were things that were a little bit tangential to our exact niche of strength and hypertrophy. So I listened to one. I can't remember the guest, but it was from a podcast. I think it's called the Omnia Performance Podcast. Have you heard of them? They do like hybrid training stuff.
Okay.
So I've been trying to think a little bit more about that recently, just because I think it's interesting, and also I've noticed we've had some more clients interested in some cardiovascular stuff. So I found myself listening to the Omnia Performance Podcast. It was an older episode. Again, I can't remember the guest, but it was good. I also listened to a recent one from Iron Culture with what's his first name? Is it Mike Ormsby?
Dr. Ormsby. Yeah.
Dr. Ormsby. I was forgetting his first name, but yeah, Dr. Mike Ormsby.
Yeah, that was really interesting.
That was really interesting.
Yeah.
Resistance training is a fat loss tool.
Yeah.
So I kind of noticed I've been a little bit tangential recently. Just sometimes that happens. But yeah, check those out if you're interested in anything that you've consumed recently.
No, I've been thinking a lot about and we might touch on this a little bit at the end of the show if we have time, but if not, it's fine. I've been thinking a lot about the kind of the wars of mechanisms versus outcomes quite a bit.
The war.
Yeah, I think that's turned into a very unnecessary divide in something that is supposed to be a synergistic process. I'm not going to go too far into it now because I'll go down a diatribe and get us away from where we actually want to go. But
it's awfully like politics in a lot of ways.
Quite literally, exactly. Like it.
We're not going there, to be very clear.
Yeah.
But
it's just it's just an unnecessarily divisive conversation that I think ultimately, if you understand it from like a bird's eye view and you look at it, it's definitely supposed to be a synergistic process. But for whatever reason, recently it's been taken as something that is like A versus B or red versus blue, however you want to phrase it. It just feels unnecessary to me. But it's something that I've been trying to come to like analogies and things to like actually be able to communicate my own position. Ultimately, I've been doing an audit on my own beliefs too. Just because of some of the discussion on it. So we'll talk about that maybe at the end if we have time. But without further ado, let's go ahead and whip up our visual here. So
only a 10-minute intro? That's all we got? So lame.
Dude, actually, no. Talk about listening to podcasts. Actually, shout out to Luke Tulloch. I listen to his podcast occasionally. I think he does a good job.
I follow him on Instagram. I didn't know he has a podcast.
Yeah. It's nice. I think it's kind of low key, but he does a very good job on like just some pretty quick takes. One thing that he does that
I've always liked Luke's stuff.
Yeah, no, me too. He does a great job on his podcast. He literally has zero intro and he immediately gets into it, and I haven't noticed how awesome that is.
You like that?
So I think I do because when you click on the episode and it has a title. And
we'll clip this out.
Yeah. For sure. I guess the point I'm saying is like to some degree, when you're making the philosophical transaction of I'm clicking this button and I would like to consume said information, and then you have 10 minutes of whatever.
Bro, no one is getting this on their recommended. This video is going to be like
you don't listen to.
It's going to be like at least
listen,
an hour and a half.
You don't listen to podcasts on your feeds?
I'm trying to think.
I think this is probably the intros are probably one reason that have driven me to be a podcast speed maniac in my ears. Just gradually
just
went from 1.5 to 2
soulless.
times to 3 times, and
3 times? 3 times is wild.
yeah, depends on the podcast.
There's only one person I can listen to it 3 times, but it's a political person, and I promised I wouldn't go there. Yeah, that's wild. I think I do
exactly
sometimes. I think I do sometimes listen to podcasts in my feed, but also I don't really use YouTube on my phone that much.
No, this is Spotify.
On Spotify.
But anyway, the point being, I think he does a great job with he specifically says this is something that he likes, so he's done it with his own podcast where he basically just immediately starts talking about the topic.
Hopefully with the 0.1% chance Luke is listening, hopefully he jumped within the timestamps. And then what was I going to say? Oh, yeah, I guess some quick plugs really quick.
Sure.
If you're not already depending on where you're listening to this, right? If you're on YouTube, awesome. Make sure you're subscribed. If you are on Spotify, go subscribe on YouTube. If you're on YouTube, go subscribe on Spotify. Leave us a 5-star rating and review. You can use another podcast player of choice if that is your jam. A review there would be much appreciated as well. If you look at the description of the podcast / video, no matter where you are, make sure you sign up for the newsletter. If you sign up right now, you're not going to get anything. Nothing's going to happen, but we're working on it. And the whole email thing is nice, right? And that's why different platforms are helpful, whether it's a podcast or a YouTube clip or Instagram or whatever. And then also email is a nice one because you're kind of saying, hey, you can hit me up directly is basically what you're saying. So I've been working on some of the educational content that'll go into the emails that you'll receive. And it's fun because I feel like I can kind of speak my mind a little bit more because it is that one-to-one interaction. So yeah, I'll hold it there. We'll get to you eventually if you enter your email, but you won't get anything for a little bit.
Oh, I just realized I've been off the screen and the tier list has been up there. But yeah, that's a good segue to
for how long?
I think about maybe a minute.
Oh, okay, that's
maybe
fine.
A minute or two.
We're jumping right in. I haven't even finished my coffee yet.
Yeah, neither have I. Okay, so let's frame a little bit about what we're doing here. So like I said, last time, Josh ambushed me with a tier list about ranking variables for strength. So this time, I'm going to ambush him with a list of variables he has not seen for ranking them for hypertrophy. So got a list here, and we have 5 levels. So the levels range from 1 to 5. Very simple. So level 1 is essentially saying this is a foundational variable. It's the base.
Wait, we're not doing the SABC.
We can do that. I just feel like people that are unfamiliar with tier lists may not totally understand what that means.
That's so straightforward. Everyone knows what an A is.
S though, I mean, I feel like I guess I maybe
you really put level 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Okay, for the listener, I can see the fact that there's a tier list, but I can't see anything about what it says. So I can't see the variables. So I'm literally going to take these blind. You put level 1.
I did put level 1 through 5, assuming some people were not familiar with the lingo. That was my assumption.
All right, we'll go with your lingo.
So level 1 would be the most important, or S tier, if you prefer.
S, A, B, C, D.
Yeah, there's no F. But
level 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5.
Yeah.
All right, man, we're definitely going to put S, A, B, C, D in the thumbnail because people will know what that is. If you put level 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 in the thumbnail, no one will know what that is. So we'll do this. But the thumbnail is definitely going to be S tier. And
I can change it if you would prefer. But
under a minute to change it.
That was less than a minute.
Less than a minute? Right. Yeah, change it. I'll fill the air with some stuff here. I'm trying to think what to talk about. Yeah, I'm going into these raw, and obviously, it's kind of tricky in terms of a tier list because, something I was thinking about because I knew Zach was gonna prepare these variables to ask me, but I haven't thought much about them, and I don't know which variables he's gonna say. But something that I was thinking about is like, is it like an absolute tier list or like a relative tier list? Because if it's like an absolute tier list, then volume, for example, has to be like a level 1 or has to be an S tier, because it's like if you have no volume, then you're not training. So I think the approach I'm going to take here is like very colloquial in the sense that I'm going to do it in the way that people will think about it. Like broadly speaking, within the ranges of volume that we tend to see in programs, to what degree does dialing that in matter?
Here's the way that I thought about it is, so for each one of these variables, let's say you have theoretically good or really good, and maybe you can touch on a little bit what you think that is for each variable if you want. But you have theoretically like pretty good, and then you have theoretically like pretty bad. And you're basically asking yourself, okay, if this variable is in the pretty bad range, how detrimental is that to overall progress? So for the example for volume, let's say, just as an example, let's say theoretical good is like 10 to 20 sets or whatever. And theoretical bad would be 1 to 5 sets or something like that. How much of a deterrent to overall progress would that be in the context of everything else? That's essentially what you're asking yourself for each variable.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
When you go through the variables, I'm gonna give so is it S, A, B, C, D?
Yeah, I changed it. Yeah.
I'll give my tier list. I'll give my my ranking, and I'll explain it. And then if you're like, nah, that's not the right way to think about it, I reserve the right to slightly shift it.
Okay. See it now?
Yeah. Zach, who is Josh Pate? Josh Pate's like backend guy. When he talks to him, is it Colin?
Yeah, Colin. Yeah,
Colin.
Yeah.
So what Josh Pate does is he'll like start saying something, but he knows he's gonna clip this later on, and then he'll be like, "Colin, actually, we're gonna start right here," and then he'll be like, "All right, this is the start of the clip." So Colin is right here, and we're gonna start the clip of the podcast where we're talking about the tiers.
Sweet. All right. Okay.
You got to intro it.
Wait, so I have to reintroduce it now because this is the clip? Okay.
This is the clip.
All right, so we're going to go through this this ranking variables list for hypertrophy. I have 17 variables here and then a couple honorable mentions I'll throw in at the end. Basically, what you're going to do is you're going to go through this 5-tier kind of system here, with S being the most important variable, D being the least important variables. I didn't put any of these as F because I don't think any of them are useless, but in terms of importance. And the way I want you to think about it is in terms of something being very well executed or poorly executed and its overall contribution to progress. So that's essentially how you're doing it. So if I put one variable in S tier, that's saying if I was poorly executing this, it's going to have a pretty detrimental effect on my overall progress.
Okay.
Or vice versa. Does that make sense?
Let's do it.
All right. First one here. Let's go with...
Nothing like putting me on the spot for the most controversial things in all of fitness with no prep. Let's do it.
Let's go with tempo. Rep tempo here to start.
You want to define that while I think about it?
So rep tempo, I would say, is the kind of overall classification of how fast are you performing the concentric, maybe adding a pause in there, and then the eccentric. So typically it's kind of X-X-X, which is the concentric pause length, and then the eccentric timing. That's kind of what I'm saying. How influential is that to hypertrophy?
So I'm going to give my initial thought, and then we'll discuss it, and I might change it, because otherwise this will be terrible to view if we talk about it for 10 minutes first. I'm going to go C tier. Here's my thinking. You can obviously mess this up in the sense that, like, if you have basically no eccentric contractions at any point because you're just letting gravity do the work, or you are training with such little intent that you're doing like a 30-second concentric, obviously you're going to leave gains on the table. But I'm going to go C tier because I don't think anyone actually does that. And there even can be appropriate applications of very slow tempo training that will at least be beneficial, or maybe not ideal, or maybe not maximize progress. But I think it's unlikely that a lot of people are missing out on a meaningful amount of gains because they're messing up a rep tempo. That's kind of how I'm thinking about it. It's like, I don't think that's a bottleneck for a lot of folks.
Spot on. Perfect.
Sweet.
All right. Number 2. Let's go intensity techniques next.
Give me
so intensity techniques, we're going to fall
falls into
into drop sets, rest pause, myo reps. I guess you could, let's limit it to that. So drop sets, rest pause, myo reps, those kind of things.
So if I were to put S tier, that means that they're awesome and people should use them more. If I were to put D tier, that means people are overusing them.
Correct, essentially.
Shoot, this one's tough.
And if you put them in S tier, you'd want to say why as well.
Yeah,
so is it, there's a variety of reasons you theoretically could put them in there.
I'm going to go C tier. I'm going to go C tier for hypertrophy. Again, the way that I'm thinking about this is I don't think that not using intensity techniques or misapplication of intensity techniques, drop sets, myo reps, what else am I missing? Drop sets,
Rest pause,
myo reps, rest pause. Yeah. Which myo reps and rest pause are like.
Yeah, it depends how pedantic you want to get, but same concept.
I don't think use or misapplication of those are like holding a lot of people back. I think they're an amazing tool. I use them for like more single joint type stuff.
Why are they an amazing tool?
I think that they're a helpful tool to probably improve the stimulus in a given amount of time with a cost that is okay or like a reasonable cost in some instances.
What's the cost?
A cost being potentially additional post-training fatigue compared to if you were to get a similar stimulus with just straight sets.
Okay, so
it's kind of the way that I think about it. There might be
mostly kind of an efficiency thing.
Yeah.
Rather than like if I had unlimited time, you wouldn't necessarily program those per se.
Yeah, I would say if someone had unlimited time, I'd probably use them quite sparingly.
Okay.
But I use them maybe for 4 exercises a week. Maybe like on average, I'm doing 1 exercise per session with like myo reps just to speed things up a little bit. But I would probably, if I had unlimited time and unlimited like focus within a session, I'd probably just rest and do another set. And I also think that just doing one really good quality set compared to adding on a drop set or adding on some myo rep clusters, I don't think that's like doubling the stimulus, if that makes sense. I think you're probably getting like most of the benefit from just doing the activation set or that initial set anyway. So I would say high C tier. I could go B tier, but I'm gonna go high C tier. But man, they're such a good tool.
I would say one question on that would be, what are you saying? What are you basing on the fact that you're getting the majority of the stimulus from the activation set?
I would just say our general understanding of the dose response within a session. So, like in other words,
okay, I see. So you're just saying that because I guess in my brain when I hear you say that is like if I had a set equated condition counting a drop or a myo rep set as a set, then you would expect greater gains from the straight sets.
Yeah.
Okay. And
you're saying like a set. So if you were to do like the 40-pound dumbbells to failure or close to it,
3 minutes
and
rest.
then drop. Well, if you're doing a drop set and you do the 40s to 1 RIR,
sure,
and then you drop to the 25s to 1 RIR,
sure,
that you're saying that would be 2 sets.
2 sets, yeah.
For a drop set, that's quicker compared to doing 2 straight sets with the 40s both times.
Correct.
I would say I would expect 2 straight sets with the 40s to be more effective.
Sure, yeah. This is one of the areas, like obviously we have the meta-analysis by Coleman that shows relatively similar hypertrophy between drop sets and straight set conditions. The one caveat there is the drop sets we're performing, I can't remember exactly. It's usually around 1.5 more sets, if I recall.
1.3 something.
Yeah, something like that. In the drop set condition, so they're taking a little bit more set volume to get to the same result. But that is one of those areas that I'm really interested to see if that kind of continues to play out in the future. This is it's like a pretty important topic, honestly, in terms of efficiency and everything that probably deserves more research. Just to really make sure we understand how those variables interact in terms of time-saving strategies.
There are some interesting drop set studies, to say the least. Not in terms of the fact that I'm skeptical of
Yeah.
the results or anything like
If you
that.
dig in the protocols,
But you're like, I don't know if that's the best way to look at them.
Yeah.
But you put them into a meta-analysis because they fit your inclusion criteria, because you kind of need wide inclusion criteria, given we don't have 10 really high-quality studies.
Yeah.
And then it's like, drop sets are pretty similar. And it's like, okay, that's awesome. But I think we'll get to some other variables where that's also the case.
Yeah.
Where it's like, right now it kind of seems that they're similar, but I'm skeptical.
Sure. Yeah, and this is
not skeptical of any work that's been done, just skeptical
I
that
know what you mean.
That's the final answer.
Your gut bro reaction is like, it seems like it might be a little bit worse. Like there has to be a cost.
And it's kind of at odds with some other principles.
Sure. Okay. Yeah, it's just like that's such a good example of the marriage that needs to occur between outcome and mechanistic rationale. Like that's just like another example.
And I think drop sets in practice can also be a little bit tricky because I do think, I don't know how common this is, but I've caught clients maybe not training quite as hard for that initial set because they know they have to keep going afterwards. Whereas if I were to just say, hey, do one really high quality set to the house.
Do you use drop sets or myo reps more often?
I use myo reps more often.
Okay, so do I. I find that, because I've experienced that with drop sets too, the overall total number of reps that you get with drop sets is considerably higher. But for myo reps, I feel like it almost helps in a way. I use them all the time, to be frank, and I share the gut reaction to you that I'm giving up something. Like you just kind of have to be in my view.
Giving up? What do you mean giving up something?
I just have a hard time believing that they're equivalent. Is I guess is my to a straight set. It's just like that seems to go against
the question to me is, to what extent are you giving things up?
Exactly. That's
I don't even think like strong proponents of drop sets or myo reps would say that
you're not giving anything up. It's just that it's not perceptible.
It's not perceptible, and it might be a small enough difference that the time savings are absolutely worth it. Yeah. Man, honestly, I do use myo reps a good bit, and it's a hell of a tool. If like we had a YouTube video where we were talking about the drop set mode on tonal.
Yep.
I've used that a few times when I'm just like really busy with like research participants or something, and I only have 15 minutes to get a session in.
Yep.
And I'm like, I'm just gonna blast like one set per muscle on this drop set mode and just go as hard as I can.
Mm-hmm.
If you haven't seen that video, basically the tonal is like, search it if you're curious what it looks like, but it goes on the wall. It doesn't have a weight stack. Basically the resistance is electrical. So with traditional training, you have to, put the 40-pound dumbbells down, pick up the 25 dumbbells, or put the 40s down, rest a little bit, pick the 40s back up again. But in the case of a tonal, the weight can change instantaneously, so you can kind of have like a continuous drop set. And is it as effective as if I were to have 3 times as much time and do straight sets? Probably not. But is it a good bang for my buck? I would almost certainly think so. So, man, now I'm starting to think high B tier.
All right.
Let's go B tier.
Let's kick them up.
Let's kick it up. You tend to agree with that?
Yeah, I use them all the time.
Use them all the time.
Personally, I think it's just like sometimes the way I think about this stuff is if you zoom out, and this maybe isn't the right way to do it. This is kind of how I think about it sometimes. What are the couple training facts that would absolutely revolutionize the way that the average person trains? And I think like drop sets or myo reps fit that category for me. Like if you would explain to the average personal trainer that you can get essentially equivalent results from the data that we have,
average busy professional,
with less than half the time, that's like an absolute game changer. But I do think they do have some, for people like us and the mega optimizer kind of crowd, I still think they do have some theoretical downside, but it's kind of that crossroads there.
Two thoughts. The first one should be quick. Just to confirm, you would not put agonist antagonist paired into that.
Correct.
Okay. Because I would put that quite higher up, and maybe we have that later on. We'll see. So just to be clear, we're talking about drop sets and myo reps specifically / rest pause, but again, that's kind of can fall into the same category in my mind, at least. Okay, the second thing I was going to say is I am a big fan of doing like additional partials after you reach full range of motion failure on an exercise that is shortened bias. So if you're doing a row and you can no longer get the implement, whether it's a dumbbell or a barbell or the machine, to your chest or whatever, Just keep going as far as you can until you can't move it anymore and kind of anchor your reps in reserve that way. In a lot of ways, it's obviously different, but it's kind of similar in concept to myo reps in the sense that you are squeezing more juice out of that initial set. I don't know if like past failure is the best way to define that. I've seen some critiques of that recently, which would be interesting to discuss. But let's just use that casually.
Sure.
You're kind of going past failure,
Sure.
in a way, or at least
past initial task failure.
Past initial task failure, or at least past the initial endpoint you had in mind, whether it's like an RAR stop.
Yeah, the initial task.
So you are squeezing a little bit more out, and we've also kind of, I think personally over the last few years, shifted towards that fatigue monster is not really all that much to worry about. And if something hurts, then yeah, address it, but you're probably fine. So yeah, I'm going strong B tier now. I'm going strong B tier.
All right, we got the first shift. All right, next one. Let's go touch on that a little bit. Let's go range of motion.
Ooh. Oh shoot, that one's tough because that's just such a broad like variable to say. Because I think I'm just going to go with my gut reaction, and then I'm going to we're going to talk about it. Maybe I'll change. Give me 10 seconds for my gut reaction. It's not really gut reaction then. Shoot, I'm going to go.
He's calculating the funding sources in his head.
Yeah, exactly.
Are you supported by big muscle length?
Big muscle length. I'm going to go. Oh, I feel like if I go A tier, I'm hopping on the hype train, but I'm going to go A tier. I'm going to go A tier. With authority, he puts it into A tier.
All right, explain.
Again, my initial thinking for each of these variables is this a like how likely is this variable to kind of hold someone back or be the reason they're not progressing? And I think range of motion is less common these days because people talk about it so much. But I don't think that like maybe that's kind of trickled into my more general population. And I still will look at pretty advanced trainees training and be like, ooh, man, I think there's some room for improvement. Like you're bringing your bicep curl to like 60% of the way down, and like probably could get a little bit more growth if you're a little bit more strict and you kind of just understand the basics of joint torque and range of motion. So I think being mindful of it is key. Do I think that the difference of getting a little bit below parallel in a hack squat compared to going ass to grass is like a game changer? No, I don't think that's going to be the reason someone doesn't, like an intermediate doesn't progress. But I think there's also plenty of people that just go, 4 inches above parallel on their hack squat and they think they're doing the right thing, and that could be holding them back.
That was kind of my gut reaction too when I was kind of putting this together and just thinking about it for myself. I think with all the range of motion talk, the conversation has almost exclusively been the people who do things with like standard full range of motion technique that's passable versus people that are extremely bought into the length and bias stuff. But the heart of this for most people is that they're not performing exercises with even a full range of motion to start to the, you know what I mean? So like when you think about it from that grounds, I think it's clear range of motion is like A tier. Now you can make the arguments that like you can perform isometrics and still grow muscle and these kind of things. But like from just like a very ecologically valid zoom out training context, I would agree it's upper tier for sure.
Regarding the isometrics though, it's like that's why it's tricky to do this, because range of motion could be, you could almost think of it as like joint angle as opposed to the joint angles traveled, or like the starting and ending position of each joint angle. Yeah. So it's tricky. But yeah, I'd go A tier because I think it's an important consideration. I think it's easy to mess up. I do think it's obviously improving, and I think it's easy to take for granted these days because it's so easy to make a video on exercise selection, and it's like perfect for YouTube because you have a visual for it, right? And it's, this new thing to try, which isn't me like, I guess, saying that that's a bad thing to do, but I'm just saying that because there's so much content on it, I think people within our niche are pretty keyed in on it. But that improvement is a result of that content, and now we might take it for granted. 100%. So yeah, let's go A tier.
I agree. All right. What do we got next here? Let's go rest periods.
I'm going to go A tier.
A tier.
So this is one that I was on
above or below range of motion.
I'll go below range of motion.
Okay.
I would say they're neck and neck though.
Okay.
So this is one where if you look at like the most recent meta-analysis by Singer, again, no issues with the work itself. Great work. I just there's a few bodies of research where you look at it, you're like, oh, okay, that's a high level finding based on the most recent meta-analysis. Download the data set if it's available. You're like, oh, interesting. Like, oh yeah, I remember reading that study 6 years ago. It had a lot of issues. Or not, again, no issues with the work, but it's just like, I don't know if this is the best way to look at the question.
Sure.
And again, if you're studying an area, or you're doing a meta-analysis on an area, and you want to have more than 2 studies, you're going to need a maybe wider inclusion criteria.
I remember you sent me is it Sousa Jr.? Is that the?
Yeah.
You sent me those a long time ago.
Yeah.
And
it was for DDSIP webinar.
Yeah.
For the real ones.
I remember that.
I
remember that. Yeah. You sent those a long time ago, and yeah, it's just if you're designing a rest period study, that's probably not the design you would directly
give a quick.
So
overview.
If you're designing a study to test the level of a variable, typically what we're talking about is one condition who's got long rest versus one condition that's got short rest. Equate as many of the other variables as you can. See how things go. The Sousa Jr. studies progressively decrease their rest intervals versus a group that kept a static rest interval, if I'm believe correctly.
I think so.
And so I can't remember the proportion of their training that was performed with rest intervals that were very similar to the other condition, but it was a pretty high amount of the time.
They weren't all, man, it's been a while.
Yeah,
but,
I can't comment on it too much. But long story short, like one group progressively changing the rest interval and the other one keeping it static, that's an additional variable that kind of, changes the waters a little bit from like an ideal comparison.
It was a rest period progression study compared to a static rest period.
Which, of course, did have differences in the average rest interval, so I understand why they included it.
Or it's just, in my mind, it's a cool study. It's a cool thing to investigate. Yeah. But I just don't know if it's all that relevant for what we're interested in for the typical person interested in improving their physique or improving their powerlifting total. That's the way that I think about it.
Sure.
But the reason I would put it in A tier, so pretty high, is that I do suspect there's a threshold at which point, you need to be recovered in order to get maximal or near maximal stimulus compared to the possible amount of stimulus you could get for the next set. I also think on the other end, some people rest way too long and could be either going home and doing other things they enjoy, or they could be doing more work if that fits within their constraints and they can tolerate it, etc. I also think, and maybe we'll get to agonist, antagonist paired sets, but I think that there are like creative ways to use your rest periods. Like if you have someone that has some athleticism goals as well, like if you're resting 5 minutes between sets of hack squats, which is probably a very reasonable rest period, you could probably do like some drop jumps, or you could probably do like some very like chill plyometric type work within those rest periods. So that's not the variable of rest periods itself, but I think rest periods can be underutilized.
Sure.
I think they can be quite simple in their application. Like, hey, you can largely just auto-regulate this, make sure you're ready to rock for the next set. Mm-hmm. But some people will just start scrolling and spend way too much time. Some people might see some of the research at large and be like, I really only need a minute or a minute and a half between my sets of bench press, and I'm going to max my stimulus. I'm quite skeptical of that.
Sure.
That's where I'm at right now.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I think the thing with rest intervals has always been tough is I feel like you maybe could argue this with volume and rep range a little bit, but like it seems to be the variable that's probably the most strongly confounded by like cardiorespiratory fitness to me. Meaning that, if I'm doing a study on volume, let's say, and I'm doing leg extensions, like I don't think that's going to be a huge limiter in terms of the muscular adaptations you're going to develop, but to manifest near maximal performance on the next set from a rest interval perspective, I do think that would be pretty strongly related. So the point being there, like it's hard to, obviously we can have general principles, but with the limited data already, and I feel like that one might be the most strongly confounded with that limitation of like people are just so much different in how in shape they are that I think it's even more stronger in terms of it's just going to need to be auto-regulated, and 90 seconds for one person, depending on the exercise and the individual, it could be totally fine. But for other people, they may be still hucking and, sucking wind, right?
Yeah. I, broadly speaking, I don't like prescribe rest periods because I think they should be auto-regulated. But then you just kind of look at session times that people report and you're like, it's a red flag.
Exactly.
But there are times where I will prescribe rest periods and just encourage people to go into the set while they're still a little tired. Because their ability to not rest 10 minutes between sets is kind of concerning.
Yep.
And maybe they don't have the time to do, 2 cardio protocols per week. Or it's just like, hey, I think the trade-off here of getting more sets in is worth it. Mm-hmm. It's obviously a balancing act. I would value rest periods pretty high, sufficient recovery between sets, but you can get creative with it. And I have just use that as a mantra for a couple folks in the past of just train fast for them because their training is just so slow paced.
Sure.
Where I'm like, dude, we're doing 5 sets a session, and that's holding back from my ability to give you more if that's what I think you need.
Right. Okay. Sweet. So we got that one down. Let's go. Let's go sessions per week.
Ooh, that's an interesting one. Within reasonable parameters, I'd say I don't know. That's a really hard one because it's if it's unsustainable, then obviously that becomes S tier because it's if the training's not sustainable, then it's not going to be effective, or you're not going to adhere to the program because you're not doing it. But I think it's pretty easy to resolve. So I'd say C tier.
C tier.
Honestly, it matters. I kind of want to say D tier, but it can be S tier at times. So let's just go C tier. I don't know. I think for the most part, most people train 4 or 5 times a week. Obviously, some people 3, some people even 2 at times. Some people are down for 6. But I'm usually able to work within those constraints, and make progress at a satisfactory rate. There are times where I'm like, hey, I think we could do less sessions per week. I think we could do more. But it's usually plus or minus 1. Mm-hmm. I think most people are pretty reasonable with their expectations there. So that's why I'd say within reasonable constraints, within practical scenarios, that's pretty low on the priority list. So I go C tier.
Yeah, I would agree. I don't think that one's hugely consequential in terms of the number of sessions per week that people typically train, which is kind of how I think about it. So I want it. It's kind of a softball, but put it in there. All right, next one. Let's go load or rep range.
Load/rep range.
Yep.
What's in B tier right now?
We have intensity techniques.
I'm going to go right above intensity techniques in B tier. Again, if you just look at the research in general, you would kind of come away with the high-level takeaway that anywhere from 5 to arguably even 50 reps per set is similar in terms of muscle growth. Again, see our discussion on rest periods, see our discussions on intensity techniques. Mm-hmm. I'm skeptical of that.
Yeah.
And I do think being targeted with load/rep range is a very potent lever depending on the scenario. So if you're trying to do 50 reps per set, or you're trying to lean into those higher reps with an exercise just not conducive for, I do think that could hold someone back. Mm-hmm. But most people, I do think, just drift towards 5 to 20 reps. So that kind of makes me want to put it in C tier. So let's go B tier, but let's go after intensity techniques.
Okay.
There's kind of low B tier.
If this was a hypertrophy 4 strength tier list.
Yeah, this is just hypertrophy in general.
Yeah, I might put it a little bit higher. I've really started to view this as, so kind of put a lot of variables into what I just call like the targeting stimulus like bucket, basically. So like I used to think of exercise selection as basically the only lever you have to pull in terms of making the exercise stimulus more targeted towards where you want it to go. But the more you kind of think about, and shout out to Cassim Hansen from N1, I think he does, a lot of people know him from the biomechanics stuff, but I think he has some interesting ideas on taking these to even another level in terms of like, okay, for a given exercise, where does, and you introduce fatigue into the equation, which reminds me a ton about, when we kind of were going through the initial proximity to failure for strength stuff. The force velocity relationship of a single contraction is not the same thing as a force velocity relationship under fatigue, and how that changes throughout a set. Those aren't the same thing, and I think the same thing can be said about the kind of the resistance profile or where the stimulus is being directed throughout a set, depending on the rep range, depending on the state of fatigue, depending on the initial exercise setup. So it's just, there's a lot that goes into it, I feel like. And just for me, when I'm dealing with like a powerlifter that I'm trying to target a specific area, this has definitely become something that I factored into my equation more than I used to. I used to just think, okay, what rep range suits this exercise? And that was about it. Mm-hmm. But now I start to think about like, okay, what is the muscle group that's going to receive the majority of the stimulus when I'm training this with heavy loads farther from failure? How does that change if I'm training it with higher you know what I mean? It's just like it's an additional variable that kind of contextualizes that more. And I think the soundbite of 5 to 30 reps or 5 to 50 reps, all the same, I think is probably lacking a little bit of nuance.
Yeah.
That could be potentially useful, particularly in the case of like a powerlifter. When you're coming to a bodybuilder, and I guess you could make the same argument if you really want to bring up a certain area, a certain muscle group, but you just have so many more tools at your disposal that it becomes a little bit less relevant probably. But I think rep ranges and kind of using those for maybe different reasons than people think is probably a little bit slept on, in my opinion.
Yeah.
I don't know if that makes sense.
If there's one thing that is like just consistently holds true, or I'm just like regularly reminded of its presence, is just the principle of specificity. So
100%.
like
100%.
Obviously you can't take that to the extreme where a powerlifter only does one rep max singles in their training. You need to walk back from specificity strategically. But to your point, there's more than just increase in muscle thickness that occurs at the level of skeletal muscle and connective tissue that might contribute to long-term strength gains. I also think there might be some room for variation in rep ranges and variation in load for hypertrophy too.
I was going to say, do you have any strong intuitions on that in general? I know the data are relatively mixed. You can have the odd citation here or there.
I would say that's like C tier, so like variation in rep range and load would probably be C tier. If I had to guess, there's probably a slight benefit to be gained there, just inherently, because I'm skeptical that the muscle growth is similar enough in nature such that it is a redundant stimulus and doesn't have some sort of additive effect.
Sure.
But I also don't think it would be like a big thing to worry about.
Sure.
I think if you just kind of match the rep range to the nature of the exercise and what's going to make the stimulus for that exercise maximal, have a decent variety of exercises, you're going to kind of cover your bases for variation in rep range.
Sweet. Okay. That one makes sense. How about go exercise order?
Ooh, exercise order. That's a great one to have on there. What do we have in A tier again? I wish I could see this.
Range of motion and rest periods.
I'm going to say either strong B tier or low A tier. Let's go first in B tier. I think this is like probably, I can make the case, this is like the most underrated variable for hypertrophy training. And this is what I was potentially going to bring up regarding sessions per week, is that there can be times where it's like, you have a given amount of priorities within the training week. And if you're only training 4 times a week, there can be times where, especially if you take a while to warm up or you're especially strong or whatever, or your volume needs are just pretty high. By the time you get to the 6th, 7th, 8th, exercise, if you want to get that amount of volume in, it can be tough just as a result of exercise order. So I would say it is honestly kind of top of mind for me when programming, even though, again, research wouldn't really indicate that. I don't know how helpful just research on that is in general, because supervision could have a pretty strong impact on your ability to maintain intent
I was going to
beyond
say,
the real world.
what do you think what is the mechanism in the real world by which that operates, would you suspect?
I think it would just be perception of effort. I think it would largely be psychological in nature.
So it's just by the end of the session, your ability to just have that gas in the tank is just kind of tapped out a little bit, which I think anyone that's done at like a relatively aggressive program, when you get to the bicep curls that you throw at the end of the session, it just isn't the same.
There's a reason powerlifters joke about skipping their accessories.
Yeah, very good way to say it.
Yeah, that
100%.
So yeah, like if I really want someone to not sandbag their accessories, then maybe I do put like that person's squat hypertrophy movement for the day before they move on to their comp bench press. If they're training both squat and bench, it'll probably come at the expense of quality for the bench press training to come. But I think that exercise order, being strategic and thoughtful with that exercise order decision, is a meaningful lever to pull. So we'll go high B tier.
Okay. Splits.
Do you have frequency on there too?
I do. So at a fixed frequency, the way in which that's organized.
That's basically exercise order, though, right? A little bit of redundancy here in the variables, but
yeah, I guess. I mean, like I guess I'm just thinking if you had a, it's tough. Yeah, this one might be redundant. When I was thinking about it, I thought it was a pretty clear separation, but maybe this one was not as good as I thought. Because I was thinking like, okay, you could have a muscle trained twice a week, but organized in multiple ways.
Yeah.
Throughout the week, I guess is what I was thinking.
Yeah, I think
so. Like basically, let's just theoretically say you had a fixed.
This is the good stuff.
I don't even know if this is possible, but let's just say theoretically, you had a 2 times a week frequency for each muscle group, but it was push pull legs, upper lower, full body, whatever. And in some way that was organized.
Okay, I think there's something here in the sense that like I think the evidence-based kind of space, especially a few years ago, let's say like late 2010s or so, was like really high in their horse about like, we don't follow splits. We just like, we decide the frequencies and the volumes we want to do, and then we organize from there, which I think is like the right way to go about it. But then it's like, oh yeah, those splits are like kind of a nice shorthand, and then you can kind of modify the splits from there. And I also think there's some psychological aspects from like, it's an upper body day or it's a lower body day. At the same time, I've kind of personally moved away from that recently, because I've noticed when I do like only 1 or 2 muscles, or like 1 to 3 muscles in a session, I'm like, I don't really feel like athletic. I kind of just feel like, I don't even know how to explain it, but like if I'm only bending my knees meaningfully twice a week, I'm like, I just don't really feel all that athletic. So for some of those psychological reasons, and maybe just like shorthand thinking about training setups, let's go low B tier. Let's go high C tier. We'll put it first in C tier. Sweet.
Okay. All right, let's get. We've been, somebody dropped in the comments how long it took us to get to this one. You probably thought it was first, but let's go volume.
What do we have in B tier right now?
We have exercise order, intensity techniques, and rep range.
Gosh, this is really hard when you're kind of comparing it to other variables. And then A tier is range of motion, and what else?
Rest periods.
I'm starting to double second guess the rest periods one. Let's go first in B tier. Again, I'm coming at this from the perspective that I don't think volume is holding the majority of people back. I do think adherence can hold a lot of people back, obviously, but I'm not going to put that within the category of volume because that's just do your training, do the training plan. But I think within reasonable ranges of volume, anywhere from a pretty low volume, let's call that 4 or 5 sets per muscle group per week of like direct sets, all the way up to like 20, maybe even 25, maybe 30 at times, direct sets per week. I just don't think someone that even does a low volume consistently over time is going to like be incredibly far from their genetic potential, or like kind of continue to see meaningful progress. I think there's a lot of things that are more important, or probably a simpler way to say this is I think training quality is way more potent than quantity, right? And volume is our way to quantify or to measure the quantity, right? So that's why I think it's obviously important. It is fascinating to a lot of people because it's so infinitely scalable and it has such a big impact on like the experience of the session. And it also, sometimes I think it can be like misapplied in a way so that it has downstream effects on other variables, right? So a lot of people think that, if you're training high volume, then you have to also be training with like higher RAR, or you have to make a bunch of other compromises in whatever ways. So I think it's important to think about the dosage of training, but I actually think the most efficient way to get the dosage in a sufficient spot is to ensure the quality of the training, and then a secondary lever is volume. What do you think?
Yeah, that's exactly how I think about it. Like, one anecdote that always sticks in the back of my brain is like this question that we don't have an answer to. I have a suspicion, I know we've talked about this a couple of times, like just like, does the organization of training get us to the same point faster, or does it allow us to actually reach a new point within our lifetime? We can talk about that at length. It's a whole nother discussion, but I guess the way that I always think about it is if you listen to anecdotes of a lot of high-level lifters, I think for the most part, they would probably agree that like the quality of the training is like a prerequisite to even thinking about that, which is usually how I think about it is like, you can take it to the extreme. And like we talked about this with like bicep curls before, is like if you're literally just like barely moving your elbow, you could do 30 sets a week.
You're actually just like leaning back and like
you could do 30, 50 sets a week of that, and you're not actually going to do anything.
Yeah.
So it's the way that I always think about it is like the quality needs to be like essentially maximized before the most efficient way to increase the dose is by turning volume up, like you said. Like,
you mean the most efficient way to increase the dose is by turning the quality up?
I'm saying that before you would even consider that, the most efficient way to increase the dose is by making sure the quality is maximized.
Yeah.
And then after that, then the most efficient way is to turn the volume up. So yeah, I tend to agree. I think probably a little bit overcorrection with the the discussion of volume is like, I would say I'd probably put it in A tier if it's not. I think it's important. I think, like we said, like everybody's like going crazy about this right now, but like in the grand scheme of things, like I think taking somebody from pretty darn low volumes to moderate volumes is a pretty meaningful bump, and I think that most people would see a pretty good bump in progress from that. So I'd probably put it in A tier. But in general, I'm
coming at it from the perspective of like a reasonable typical range of volume. I think a lot of programs tend to just land there naturally.
Right.
But obviously, I hold the belief that some programs are better than others, and I think volume is one of the primary ways to do that. Volume is also probably your primary way, in addition to exercise order, maybe even exercise selection to some degree in terms of like the complexity of setup, to kind of customize a program to someone's preferences and their goals. So it's very high B tier. Yeah, maybe I'm like overcorrecting just because I think some people can.
It's arguable. I mean, it's not a.
Yeah, some people can like I think just put way too much stock into like their set volume.
Yeah, 100%.
I don't.
It's like a badge of honor in a way.
Yeah.
Well, at least it used to be for sure.
Yeah, but like, and then I'm also coming at this from a I think a pretty practical perspective. Like, don't even talk to me about whether you're doing 10 or 14 sets per week on a given muscle group if like the other things that maybe we'll get to are actually an S tier or high A tier aren't in place, because those things are not necessarily, they're simple, but they're not necessarily easy.
Yeah. I also think about like if you accept the premise that coaching or like personal training is effective, and like pretty meaningfully so, I would say the majority of the things that personal trainers or coaches are doing is not scaling up people's volumes. You know
Yeah.
what I mean? And I tend to think that's extremely high leverage. Like when you have a client, like you can change a couple of things related to quality, and like it massively inflates
Yeah.
the stimulus versus like, yeah, just come back and do the same session, later this week.
Yeah,
or
that's
whatever.
like the most common feedback when someone like joins our previous programming systems, DDSIP or Infinity programs, or they work with one of us or one of our coaches, is that like, ah, man, the volume seemed a little bit lower than I anticipated.
Yeah.
But progress is better, right? And that's largely because we're not pulling the volume lever, at least to
The
start.
dose is going up, but the volume's going down. That's the way I always think about it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Particularly in targeted areas.
One caveat I want to add here is while I'm putting volume in high B tier, I would say that understanding the dose response relationship of volume to the outcome of interest is S tier because I just think that's vital, right? Like some of these I've kind of gone based on my best guess in terms of experience, vibes to some degree, and tangential training principles that I feel more confident in, and I'm putting those in certain tiers accordingly. I think the variables that we have a pretty good look at the dose-response relationship of, like, I guess really for all variables, understanding how they work or their dose-response relationships effectively is S tier because that can inform where they go. I think we talked about this in the last podcast in the sense that, like, because there isn't this clear cap of gains, again, maybe there is a plateau with different statistical methods, maybe with additional data, maybe with different characteristics of the training participants, there is a clear plateau. Maybe there's even a start of an inverted U in terms of the dose-response relationship of volume and muscle growth. But as it stands right now, there doesn't seem to be this like very clear cap. And to me, that's really helpful to know that this is a lever I can pull. It's also very helpful to me to know that quality becomes more important because if quality, if there was a cap in muscle growth that you could kind of experience within a 10-week study, then you could kind of make up for the lack of quality by just doing more volume. But to me, it almost flips this on its head. It's like, okay, there is no clear cap or kind of plateau in the dose-response of volume and hypertrophy. Therefore, we need to make sure that quality is as high as possible so we get off the ground, and then we can just kind of squeeze out what we can within constraints and just practical programming to get as far up that dose-response curve as we can. And oftentimes that does kind of manifest in low to moderate volumes is the way that I think about it.
Yeah, I think that's totally reasonable.
Cool.
All right. Deloads.
Ooh. My gut reaction is low B tier, probably last in B tier. What does that put it right behind?
Rep range.
It's so hard to compare those. What does that put it right in front of in terms of high C tier?
Splits.
Oh man. What's after splits?
Rep tempo.
It's definitely above rep tempo. Yeah, I think it's fine right there. Maybe
Seems reasonable. You're forming a little normal distribution. It looks good.
yeah, most are going to be B tier.
Yeah,
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I think so. I'm right now in kind of the home stretch of data collection for a study in the calves, specifically the gastrocnemius, where it's a within participants design, and it's a relatively long study. Long story short, one leg on each individual is doing consistent volume the entire time. There's no variation in it. And I would say it's like moderate volume. The other leg is also doing that moderate volume for some blocks. Other blocks, they're taking a couple steps back and doing low volumes, kind of like a maintenance dose. And then they're kind of cycling between lower and moderate volumes. And I think that's been a nice refresher to me because it's quite isolated because of the research question to just the calves. But a lot of people do enjoy the variation. And one of the main reasons is because the aches and pains on that calf are generally lower. And I think that's kind of the primary benefit of deloads in practice is just to kind of catch up recovery-wise. I think deloading every 4 or 5 weeks is a little bit overrated. For hypertrophy specifically, I think mesocycles can be quite a bit longer than that. But I do think they are important to incorporate for both physical and psychological reasons here and there. And I also think they're a nice way to like have something to look forward to that's not training and then use a deload as an excuse. So in other words, if you know you have a vacation in 10 weeks, okay, let's do a deload that week. You're going to look forward to the vacation. You're going to finish training strong going into the vacation. And you kind of kill two birds with one stone in the sense that you might get some of the benefits from a deload. You also get to go enjoy your vacation, not worry about training quite as much, and then be ready to rock when you get back. So kind of a practical element there as well.
Removing the practical element, do you think that, I guess, just frankly, do you think deloads are required to maximize progress?
Oh, man, that's so hard to give a yes or no. Required? Removing the practical elements, that's like impossible. Like, would you consider aches and pains to be a practical element?
I guess I'm coming at it from the perspective of, I know some people take the position that if you are essentially, you're suspecting that you're accumulating fatigue. If you are doing that, your programming's wrong. Your programming's bad, is essentially the position that other people take. So like if you are having aches and pains or you are doing these things, you're just doing too much, and change the programming rather than changing, like putting a Band-Aid on it with a deload is essentially that position. Not saying I necessarily take that, but that's the opposition to what I understand.
I think that's position is, like, I would agree with that. Just the extent to which I'd agree with that, I'm not sure of. Like, I think I might agree with that in the sense that, like I said, if your training is so unsustainable, you have to deload every 4th week. For hypertrophy specifically, for the powerlifters listening, I think it's a little bit different. Yeah. But for hypertrophy specifically, then you should fix your programming, because if I had to guess, the net benefit of less deloads in the calendar year compared to maybe less volume or
that's exactly how I think about it. Is like,
but if you're going 52 weeks and you don't need a little bit of a break,
it's like an if. It's an if-then statement to me. Is like, if one approach leads to more cumulative, high-quality training under the curve over the course of the year, that's probably the one that I would favor. That's
exactly.
So exactly. Like, if you're telling me that
can look quite different for different folks.
Yeah, and if you're telling me that scaling your training down so you basically never have to deload does that for you, then yeah, okay, that seems to make sense to me then. But I would probably be pretty surprised if that's the case.
Your question was, are deloads required to maximize progress?
Yeah.
I would say categorically no, but I think most people should use them. But I think it's very reasonable to use them very infrequently is my answer. Yeah.
I'd say probabilistically yes, but required no.
Yeah, and what we know based on like some of the detraining, retraining, and the little bit we have on, I'll just say, tangential studies or tangential study designs to volume cycling, it's unlikely that any lost gains you had for 1 week, especially if it's relatively infrequent, are not going to just lead to slightly accelerated progress when you do return to normal training. Yeah. I also just think in general, like, I'm not going to go there. That's another rabbit hole. But you think the placement I gave there is reasonable?
I think it's reasonable.
Cool. We might be the first tier list video that A, is this long, and B, we
can't see the screen.
I can't see the screen. And lastly, that we're focused on the fact that it's a normal distribution. So that means we're going to need an S tier and we're going to need a D tier.
Absolutely. Here's the next one. Logbooking. So this is specifically being
that's a good one.
Very intentional about writing down your numbers, making sure that you're beating the logbook every week if you can.
Okay, you're getting too extreme with it now.
Okay. Just the concept of like being like pretty darn meticulous with tracking your training.
What's in A tier again?
the recap.
Can you text this to me while I'm talking next?
Range of motion and rest periods.
I think I'm gonna go A tier. The question is where in A tier I'm gonna go. Yeah, perfect. And I'll pull that up on my computer. Yeah, shout out to the editors for taking this one out for the clips that'll come. But full podcast listeners, you're a real one, so you'll deal with it. We appreciate you. Yeah, we're gonna go A tier for logbooking. I'm going to put it. I think categorically it has to be like probably the most important thing. Yeah, I think let's put it first. Let's go first in A tier. Let's not. Shoot, it might be S tier. It might be S tier. Let's go S tier. We're going S tier for logbooking. Oh man, this one's tough because I don't want this to be viewed or the interpretation to be like I have to be so precise with my training that now I can't. It's not even worth it to go drop in at another gym if I'm traveling and now the numbers are kind of irrelevant. I think the skill of being able to go train hard, get a productive session in, even on not your normal equipment, I think is an important one because something is obviously better than nothing. But I think long term I think logbooking just kind of covers a lot of the other bases. So like proximity to failure, I'm sure is one that we're going to get to. I think probably the best way to dial in proximity to failure is just to keep a good logbook and to kind of know what your best is on a given set of 10, right? If you know your best for a set of 10 on leg press is 500 pounds and you're doing sets of 10 to 12 on leg press, that's probably a good indication you should try to beat that or at least keep yourself honest to stay in that ballpark, right? It's not to say you have to like beat it every single session. So I guess like just to kind of list out some of the potential misinterpretations is that doesn't mean you have to always do the exact same thing every single week. I think you should aim for that, but don't get stressed out about that. Don't feel like that means you can't have productive sessions if you're not hitting PRs. And that doesn't mean that you shouldn't like adjust the equipment settings if there's a better way to do it or a better exercise for you, but you're sticking with something longer than you should in the name of logbooking. But with those caveats aside, yeah, I think high A tier or S tier.
So let's take this from the perspective of, I guess I'm trying to play devil's advocate for.
I don't think you would put this in S tier, would you?
Really depends on the person.
Yeah.
I do think it's. How do I articulate what I'm saying? So let me describe the avatar that I was thinking in my brain as a devil's advocate first, and then we'll come back to the other one. The devil's advocate in my brain is saying I have a person who doesn't necessarily like to be that meticulous with it, and just likes training hard and goes in and takes every set to failure, maybe 1 RER or something like that, uses different pieces of equipment regularly, etc., just because they enjoy it.
Yeah.
Is that person going to be significantly missing progress because of the fact that they're a little bit, I don't want to say disorganized, but maybe a little more lax with it? I'm not sure.
I think it's almost similar to nutrition in the sense that like you could, in theory,
Vibes your training totally.
fly by the seat of your pants and still like hit your macros, like loosely track things like that. And at the end of the day, what's going to actually drive the results is the fact that you're hitting your
The
protein
macros,
target.
Not that you know that you're hitting your macros. I guess is the way that I view it. Same thing with training. It's like
I'm coming at this from a slightly different angle, so hear me out and let me know what you think. So let's say like someone that kind of flies by the seat of their pants in terms of nutrition, but they still track, they still hit their macros, they still hit their protein target. That's great. At the end of the day, if they're actually doing that, if they're actually hitting their calorie target or their calorie range or their protein range, that's what's going to matter for their progress. But I would question that they're actually going to do that if they don't have structure. So to me, nutrition structure is similar to like logbooking and training. To me, the nutrition structure makes it actually sustainable and more likely to hit those things sustainably. Same with logbook. Sure, you could say you're training to failure, but everyone has those days where they don't want to be training. Yeah. But if they have the logbook to keep them honest, I think that can be the difference of having a productive session. Then obviously that adds up.
Okay, yeah, I was gonna make the counter to say that like having like a rough training split kind of thing is kind of some structure. You could argue like I do push pull legs or whatever, and I go in and I do I'm going to do 10 sets to failure for these muscle groups. I don't know what that's going to look like. I don't know what rep ranges. I don't know what exercises, but I'm going to take them all to failure, 0, 1 RIR. In theory, that's kind of similar to like kind of just trying to hit your protein and stuff. Now, I'll take the devil's advocate. To be clear, I think that person can probably make like pretty darn good progress, honestly, because the way that I view it is like, it's not the fact that you know you're hitting your macros that's leading you to making progress. It's the fact that you are hitting your macros. And similar with training, it's not the fact that you know that you're achieving a progressive stimulus. It's the fact that you are achieving a progressive stimulus or maintaining the stimulus that's required for progression, I guess is a more accurate way to put it. So I think that's true. That said, I have been surprised, I guess, with clients who are relatively tapped in and are like care a lot about their training, that certain things like that are more of a barrier than you'd expect. I don't know if it's like,
we were just talking about like before we started recording, is like rigidity versus less rigidity for how you structure communication with clients and how there are pros and cons to each. I think it's kind of similar with logbooking.
Very. Like, I don't know if it's like, I think once you get past a certain...
I'm picking up what you're putting down.
Yeah, it's once you get past a certain point, like adding that extra 5 pounds doesn't have the same buzz, I don't think, anymore, I guess is kind of the way they put it. So like, let's say you got 5 plates on the leg press or whatever. Like the drive to put that 5 pounds on, I don't know if it's the same as when you're initially lifting and the rate of progress is so strong.
That is the primary thing that gets me fired up for training these days.
That's really good. I guess what I'm putting is like, I guess the way that I'm putting it is like I'm not saying the drive to progress isn't there.
Yeah.
I'm saying on like...
So you're saying they still know what they should be hitting?
No. I'm trying to give my real opinion now. It's like, I think logbooking is incredibly important.
Oh, okay.
I guess what I'm trying to say is like, I'm trying to figure out why for people who I think are relatively tapped into training and like care about it, and why is that a thing? Because in theory, it shouldn't be in my brain. Like, because I just described why in concept, I don't really think it matters. Similar to tracking your nutrition, I don't think that necessarily matters. But
to me,
there's a psychological barrier of some kind that is less clear with training than it is with nutrition.
I think it's there for nutrition as well. Like, to me, structure for nutrition
I'm saying that's way clearer because food is part of our lives. Food is part of our lives in so many different ways, to the fact that if you don't have a plan or you don't track it, it's going to be very easy to fall off. Whereas with training, I feel like that's less true. But logbooking is still very important in my experience. So now I'm trying to...
I don't think it's less true.
Really?
I don't think you're less likely to fall off.
Interesting.
I think what you said to start, that it's person dependent, I think is very true, to be honest. Man, because I'm starting to question the S tier ranking, because I do know people that don't track their training that meticulously that are having no problems making gains, and to put logbooking as S tier and nothing else as S tier. But honestly, man, I'm looking at all these variables now that I can actually see it. And I feel like here's kind of my my take. I'm starting to think none of these are S tier, and like lifestyle, structure, ticking your boxes is the actual S tier, because that's actually permissive to everything below that actually working.
I agree with that strongly.
So let's change. Let's keep logbooking as number 1
in A.
In A tier, but now it's an A tier.
Yeah.
So now we have a normal distribution, which is also pleasing. Yeah, man, I'm like looking at this, and I don't love the fact that range of motion is so high. Don't love the fact that logbooking is so high. But I don't see anything that like I'm
right.
Like, I think I hate this. What I'm saying is I hate this, but also I'm having a hard time, at least in the moment, making it better. I'm starting to wonder. I was gonna say I'm starting to wonder if exercise order should be higher.
I'll give you a bone. Let's go exercise selection.
Oh, that's the S tier.
Yeah, that's easy. Yeah.
And that's redundant with range of motion, so that makes me want to put range of motion lower. Because to me, I think actually
they're combined. To some degree.
They're combined. But I would put range of motion a little bit lower.
Yeah.
Than exercise selection. So, okay, cool. So we have logbooking first in S tier, first in A tier.
Yep.
And then we have
rest periods. Then I just put range of motion down below rest periods.
Okay, perfect. Sweet. I like it. is one of your variables that's going to come is like execution of exercise?
So when I wrote down exercise selection, I was thinking equipment, muscle length, resistance profile, those kind of things. So basically, if I have a given joint action, the constraints in which I'm operating that joint action effectively.
Yeah.
So range of motion is separate from that in concept.
Yeah, I think exercise selection is S tier because it kind of encapsulates a lot of other things. It encapsulates range of motion. In a way, it encapsulates logbooking because like you could make the case that like consistency of exercise selection, which I do think it's a bit of a stretch, but
that's a stretch.
But yeah, I would put that in S tier because, and we've talked about this throughout this podcast at times and also in recent episodes, that like it's easy to mess that up. It's easy to choose a poor exercise for the target muscle for you and either just greatly inhibit your ability to tolerate sufficient workload and or just not efficiently target the muscle. And yeah, exercise execution, I think, is like, that's what gets you off the ground. Appropriate execution of the right exercises. That's not to say you need to stress out about the difference between a preacher curl and an incline curl.
I was just gonna give you the hard example.
That's the thing. I think
I'm somebody who's pretty bought into training.
I think people have gone a little bit over the top with it. Like I think standing dumbbell curls are just fine, brother.
I was gonna say. So let's say I'm somebody who's, pretty bought into training, right? I got your grassroots community gym. I'm thinking of the place I used to work out when I was in high school. Let me tell you, brother, they didn't have any prime equipment there. They're nothing.
Plates, they
have tetanus on them and all kinds of cool stuff like that. Yes. Is it worth for my overall progress over the course of my career to go to a different gym? Like, is it of that level of importance?
You keyed that up so that the answer is no, but I think it depends. I have had a couple folks that train in a garage gym where I was like, I think, like, can we get a Planet Fitness membership and go there once or twice a week?
Yeah.
Like, let's just find the cheapest solution to that, or Gold's Gym or something like that. Or
what specific problems are you trying to solve most often there?
So, I have two clients. One of them was already doing that before we started working together. The other one, so I guess that's really only happened. No, you know what? I take that back. I have 3 clients that do that, and 2 of them I encourage them to do it. Just because I felt like I was running into a wall in terms of finding solutions to problems with their equipment availability.
Like, what's an example? I was just trying to get like one example of this.
One person just having a hard time tolerating sufficient dose of training is just what it comes down to, is largely tolerance. And
so you're trying to cram in some lower body volume with like high bar or whatever, and it's just not working.
It's just not working. There's too much going on. I'm just like, man, I would love to have some machines. So I was just honest and just, hey, this isn't required. We can keep trying. I'll keep trying to be as creative as possible. We've tried BFR. We've tried XYZ for months, and I feel like this would be worth it. There's no pressure if you don't want to get a gym membership. That's very real. That's very reasonable. You already have a home gym. But just being honest, I think that's would be a lever to pull to at least try. That
seems reasonable. That's tier then to me. Yeah.
But I to be very clear, you can definitely go over the top with it.
For sure. But I do think, like, again, I think a lot of this is like counter speech to how much exercise selection and range of motion and everything is being talked about.
Yeah.
But I do think if you like sift through that and like get you meta-analyze all the anecdotes and all the discussion, you get a good sense of the pulse on where things are at and like how much that actually does move the needle. I do think it's still pretty high. It just probably isn't hyperbolic like some make it seem potentially. So I think that's reasonable. Let's see what we got next.
For the people that are going to comment all the mistakes we made or how we should have had something different, I'm with you. I hate this.
That's kind of the point, though.
Yeah, I hate this. This just like, there's so many issues with this tier list. None are jumping out at me right now that I'm like, we need to change it, but it's hard.
Here's one. Let's go muscle specificity. So by that, I mean I'm going to train my biceps in a unique way compared to my quads, etc.
Oh. Ooh. In terms of like the principles of training?
Yeah, just I guess like when I'm going down to write down a program, how much does it necessarily matter which muscle group it is? Obviously, like certain massive things are different, like the fact that lower body exercises are typically axially loaded. That's like put that aside a little bit more. So
How do you put that aside though? To me,
it's I guess I was more so thinking like the architectural characteristics of a muscle, stuff like that.
I think that's got to be B tier.
Normal distribution cope.
Yeah, I think that's got to be B tier. I would say probably last in B tier. I do think that's like an impossible one to answer that you just gave me because I wouldn't. I mean, like think about squat, bench, deadlift, right? Like you don't program. There's kind of inherent differences in terms of typical frequencies.
I guess I'm thinking
volumes.
about it from hypertrophy's perspective.
Yeah, I know. I'm just using that as an analogy, right?
Yeah, that's clear.
In the sense that like side delts, just inherently you can kind of train them a little bit differently compared to hamstrings.
How so?
Are you memeing?
No, like give an example.
Like on average, I'll put it this way, if you want to really prioritize one of those muscles, you're gonna have a little bit more liberty or a little bit more flexibility to be aggressive with the lateral delts.
Do you think that's because, like, do you think your experience is based on that due to some of the, I don't want to call it prehistoric at this point, but like more traditional exercise selection? Like how much, like back is always the example I think about, like volume recommendations and training recommendations for back are all essentially made on
inflated
machines,
in a way.
Inflated because of the, the short and biased nature of pretty much all the exercises. Do you think that influences that? Like, do you think that's a true difference, or do you think, like, I
think that would have to be an architectural difference, at least to some degree.
Okay.
But that's why I would say it's like, but then you were also saying that doesn't count in a way.
What's that? What do you mean? This is a bad one. I made this list at 6 a.m. this morning. So.
this is a tough one, but yeah, we'll just put in B tier. I think people are picking up what we're putting down. It's like you're obviously not going to just have the same exact frequency, volume, muscle length challenge for every single muscle group.
I guess I'm saying that are the principles like highly muscle dependent, and they don't seem to be.
No, I would say the principles are not highly muscle dependent, but I am thinking about what muscle is being trained when I'm programming, so that's why I put it in B tier. I could maybe see the argument for high C tier.
Frequency.
Dramatic pause. Let's go right before deloads.
Okay.
So now it goes.
This one's a hot take.
Yeah, we'll put frequency right before. Ooh, the fact that frequency is after intensity techniques.
Yep.
Woo!
Hot take. Let's hear it.
Should I flip those? I think within the thing about frequency is that that's kind of been like a hot thing recently, and I've noticed that people even seem to care about it at least right now more than volume, which is interesting.
100%.
So yeah, that was gonna be an interesting one. Hey, for the person that's writing the comment right now, I hate this too. I hate this too. But here's the thing: is I think people battle over frequency, but everyone actually does the same thing for frequency. That's the thing. Yeah. Quote unquote high frequency proponents, or maybe a better way to put it is
that's the thing. That dude, literally, this is the thing. Is like the high frequency proponents they used to be like I remember when the high frequency stuff like initially started like times a week. I'm gonna train every muscle every day.
All right, it wasn't 7. I think it was.
No, I'm pretty sure like wasn't frequency stuff like training things like most muscle groups like.
I think it was more than 4. I
session.
think it was more than 4.
I don't mean that in like a negative way. Like you can design that in a way that's not totally.
Yeah, I mean, like no, like it is enticing, especially with where the research was at the time.
Yeah, right. Yeah, but the point being like that used to be high frequency to me. And like, I guess I come at it from like the powerlifting perspective too, like the Norwegian Frequency Project or like those kind of things.
And people conflated strength and hypertrophy stuff.
Yeah. So when I hear high frequency, I'm thinking like at least 4 times a week, but probably more than that. And then now high frequency is training the muscle group 3 times a week. And it's just like,
I don't even know about that because it depends on the volume frequency combination. Like,
well, I guess,
in other words,
I guess what I'm saying is
I don't even think that there are any high frequency proponents these days. I think they would just say that frequency is like the primary variable compared to volume.
Correct. And you want to maximize frequency relative to what you can. But that point is like around 3 times a week.
Within what you can, yeah. Which tends to fall within 2 to 3 times a week.
Yeah, which is
what people that would take the more
frequency isn't that important.
Yeah, I guess like I don't even know how to explain this. I want to say evidence-based, or maybe just like maybe they focus a little bit more on the outcome-oriented research,
sure.
Which tends to indicate that there isn't like a strong effective frequency beyond 1 time per week. They still are like, might as well train it twice a week. Yeah. And maybe there's even a reason to do it 3 times per week if it's convenient or if it's more practical.
Yeah.
So that's a long way of saying part of the reason I have frequency where it's at is because everyone kind of does the same thing anyway, or at least similar things. So I'm not going to put it, but I'm also not going to put it in like C or D tier because I do think frequency like indirectly affects exercise order in a way. So like there's a lot of overlap here. And like I really like to train arms on days where I'm not doing my compound upper body days. So like what I was doing for a while when I was training 6 times per week was I would do like a lower body day and like a torso day, like push and pull,
yep.
and then an arm day. And I guess in a way frequency was higher for arm training, but not in the name of frequency, more so in the name of exercise order and just quality and having more focus for those sets.
Yeah.
But that kind of falls into frequency. So, but yeah, hopefully that makes sense. I think there's a reason most programs kind of fall at 2 to 3 times a week, and everyone doesn't actually disagree. I think a lot of people are just talking past each other.
100%. Yeah, I agree. I think it's just like the conversations around frequency often lack the context necessary to meet in the middle and realize the practical conclusions are the exact same. Like that's the interesting thing to me. I think people are probably coming to pretty strongly different conclusions when it comes to volume, but the frequency recommendations are relatively similar. Now, the certain side of that would say, yeah, but the frequency is dependent on the volume that you're doing, and that's a whole nother discussion. Yeah. But
and
like
our lab will be coming out with some, I would say, some of the stronger evidence for frequency for hypertrophy in recent years. It's not like overwhelming.
Sure.
More to come on that. But like that's kind of baked in as well, and that's why I'm not putting it like, because if you were to just take the meta-analytic perspective, might have to put C or D tier. But then again, it did have a 91% likelihood of the slope being positive, so it's worth keeping in mind, but it's not A tier in my mind.
Proximity failure.
I think you got to go S tier for this one. Again, what you'll notice is that variables revolving around quality of training, or another way to think of that is how potent any given dosage of training or any given set or any given exercise that you're doing, those tend to be S or A tier. And then next is kind of volume / exercise order, which influences the magnitude of that dosage. And then after that, you kind of have the exact things that are like more configuration of the dosage, if you will. So I think it's got to go S tier. In terms of its where it goes compared to exercise selection, I think it's a coin toss. I might put it...
In some ways, you could say both of those are like the foundational components because they both say like, where does the stimulus go? And then how do we make sure the stimulus is like relatively maximized on a per set basis? So it's like kind of 1A, 1B to me.
Exactly.
I guess the way that I view it is like without proper exercise selection, and you could go close to whatever the task is, you could go close to failure, but that may not actually be super stimulative. It's just the most stimulative it could be. You know what I mean?
If we can change exercise selection to exercise selection and execution, then that's first, then proximity to failure.
Yeah. Okay.
That's so. It might not say it on the screen, but we're thinking of it as exercise selection and execution. That goes first.
Okay.
But still, that makes me like think we're over-indexing on that. 'Cause proximity to failure, whatever. I've said this sucks.
How about novelty?
Ooh.
Getting a lot of oohs in these last couple.
Let's go right before rep tempo, after splits in C tier. I think this might be a minor variable in C tier. Yeah. So it goes splits and then novelty.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, splits and then novelty. I think there might be something there, but I think if there is something there, it is relatively small in terms of its effect. And it might also be for practical reasons, right? Kind of similar thinking to the deload sort of thing. Is like you can, Cassim Hansen, who I know you mentioned before, would probably be a good person to ask on this, is like maybe instead of deloads, you could just leverage novelty to get a similar effect to the deload, but not have to bring your workload way down to still have a productive training week. So, or like Mike Toucher as well, like with pivot weeks, okay, we're going to target some other
You're
things.
essentially targeting different adaptations or different systems rather than, like that's the way you're thinking about deloading rather than workload necessarily is kind of what I understand. Both of them kind of think about it in that way.
So, all right, actually you were right. Let's go above splits. So high C tier. It's hopefully we'll learn more about novelty soon. The study I mentioned that we're doing data collection for right now, to me is like the most, at least my thinking. Looking forward to critiques on this once the paper is out. But kind of the thinking with the design of it is like, if novelty is a thing that has an isolated independent effect beyond some of the practical stuff, it should show up here. And if it doesn't, that's not to say novelty is useless, but it's at least not useful for like isolated independent effects of novelty on muscle growth. It's not to say that this will be like the nail in the coffin for novelty, or maybe it's really exciting for novelty. We'll see, depending on the outcomes. But as it stands right now, I think there's some practical use cases and maybe some slight physiological benefits, but I don't think it's anything that's like, got to confuse the muscle or whatever to just spark new gains.
Sure. What time course do you usually think about that on? Be the only other piece of context.
I think of it on probably like maybe somewhere in the 8 to 24 week range, like not on a week to week basis, but maybe on like a mesocycle to mesocycle basis or a macrocycle to macro basis. And also novelty can be a nice way to address things that you haven't addressed, because sometimes when you're designing a program, you're like, if I try to cover all of my bases, I just kind of run out of space. I run out of time in the week. So maybe I'm not doing isolated readult training right now. But maybe a way to cover your bases for that in the future is to put some of that in later on at the expense of something else. And in a way, that's novelty. But again, that's more on the practical side of things.
Right. Okay. We got final two that I'm going to kind of group together. We have resensitization and periodization, which I know are both close to your heart with the PhD project you've kind of been hinting at already.
Let's go resensitization first. I'm having a hard time thinking of both of those at once. So let's go resensitization first. Okay, I was kind of conflating novelty and resensitization, so that's a tricky one. Let's put them right next to each other. Let's put resensitization right after novelty, because to me, if resensitization is a thing, then novelty also must be a thing.
Right.
So that's why novelty has to go first. But by studying resensitization, you're kind of studying both. Just for the listener, because I know this is kind of a not a very common word to use. Resensitization basically means when you decrease the magnitude of stimulus or change the nature of the stimulus, when you return to the original stimulus, do you have an amplified effect compared to if you were to have stayed with that original stimulus the whole time? The short answer is we don't know right now. Again, we're working on some stuff to look into that because that has pretty high level effects, or I should say like broad sweeping effects, I think, in terms of our understanding of some of these other principles and some of these other variables that we've talked about with this ranking stuff. But as it stands right now, resensitization is absolutely a thing because of the detraining and retraining research, in the sense that, okay, if you stop training for a while, you're going to lose muscle. But it also seems that when you return to training, your rate of muscle growth is faster than the original training bout. That is, I don't want to say the nail is in the coffin on that. So I was actually thinking about this recently because there's a new paper titled Muscle Memory in Humans, Evidence for Myonuclear Permanence and Long-Term Transcriptional Regulation After Strength Training. That was published kind of in the second half of 2024. And it definitely trended in the direction of, faster muscle growth after detraining compared to the original training period. But it wasn't an overwhelming finding. It was a relatively low sample size, but it was also a long study, so props to the researchers for that. So long story short, I would say in aggregate, the research seems to indicate that resensitization is a thing following detraining, but whether it's a thing following reduced workload training like a deload or an extended deload or a change in training style remains to be seen, and I think we'll get some more research on that relatively soon. But for now, that's why I put it in C tier, because I don't think it should be like top of mind for program design.
Sweet. Okay. Periodization. So periodization obviously is like an umbrella of all these variables. You're just effectively changing them over time.
Would you consider deloads to be periodization?
Yeah.
Oh, really?
Yeah, like I think essentially all of these are part of periodization because you can manipulate any of them. The questions I'm going to ask you here in a second are going to be like, how would you actually design periodization given light of this tier list? In
a way, would logbooking be periodization?
I wouldn't count that.
Yeah.
Logbooking to me is like an execution technique. Or it's a way to aid execution, essentially, of a given set of training variables to me.
It's going to go in that cluster of like deloads, novelty, resensitization. To me, it's just a question of where. I guess it would have to go before deloads, right? Yeah. Because if you have deloads where they are, then if you have deloads where they are, then and deloads are a part of periodization would kind of have to go before it, and periodization is more all-encompassing. So my cop-out there is that it's not everything under periodization. It's maybe certain things that are helpful.
Okay.
So, that's where I'm at. Again, I hate this. There's nothing in D tier.
Couple quick honorable mentions that I don't have cards for, but hopefully the very nice editor will add these in the real one. How about cardio for when training for hypertrophy?
Ooh. I'd say B tier, and the nice thing about not having cards is you don't have to decide somewhere to put it.
Yeah.
But maybe right before periodization.
Okay. In
a way, I actually think just being out of shape can be a
pretty big deterrent
to progress. I think that has downstream effects on your ability to just handle training and train hard consistently, not have to deload every 4 weeks, that sort of thing. Yeah. I also think you just feel better for training. You can recover faster between sets.
It's another one of those old school strength conditioning things I've come back to, and just you got to have some GPP, which is obvious. And again, shout out to Lou Simmons, who I think got so much right with just the information he had available. He was pretty big on that too, in addition to all the other training variables for strength that I think he got right.
I don't think it needs to be like a crazy amount.
Yeah.
It also almost certainly shouldn't be like very high intensity, very fatiguing if hypertrophy is the number one goal. Yeah. But I do think it's quite common to completely disregard it. Mm-hmm. And, maybe maybe you were more active earlier in life, and then those cardiovascular adaptations just kind of slowly decline over time. Next thing you know, you're like, oh my gosh, two sets of squats today. This is going to be brutal.
Yeah, the
it's
comment
like, dude, you used to do 6 sets with no problem.
I was say the comments of like I can't recover from that
are
usually never combated with how do I improve my recovery directly. That's a good
point.
Thing that I think about quite often. And there's a lot of cases.
Yeah, there's no way high volume is better because I'm however many years old and work a desk job, which it's not an attack on your character or whatever. It's just kind of the reality. Yeah. I'm experiencing that as well in the sense that like it can be hard to get the activity that I want to get in each day. Yep. I think that's impacting my cardiovascular performance or capacity, and therefore having some impacts on hypertrophy training.
100%.
But when I was, a few years ago, maybe just more active in general, and also in closer proximity to when I was, playing sports 10 hours a week.
I was going to say, I always think of the examples of like college students. So their entire life is obviously designed around like the people, at least the people like us when we were in undergrad. Your entire day is designed about when I'm going to the rec center. You're often walking across campus to classes, so that's just hitting conditioning in there throughout a lot of the time. You're usually closer to the time when you played high school sports, if you did, which is, again, just additional cardiovascular capacity. And you train like an absolute madman, often doing more of it than we would now. And then
you go to the dining center for 2 hours afterwards, just eat as much as you can.
And you sleep and everything. And then gradually over time, you start removing one of those things kind of one by one. Like now I work from home, don't walk to class or walk to the gym as much anymore. I'm farther away from when I played high school sports. All those things kind of drop out one by one. And then you're like, man, why can't I recover from training like I used to? And it's
it's got to be the age.
Yeah. And it's like, no,
but
it's just
it's like aging might have independent effects.
Sure.
That you can't control.
Yeah.
What you can't control is your activity, or at least you can attenuate the decline if you were very fit at one point. But I do think there's a good way to put it. Like people will, if see something on volume suggesting moderate volumes might be worth giving moderate volumes a shot, and they're like, oh, I try to do 4 sets of curls instead of 2 sets once, and I was fried, so therefore high volume doesn't work.
Yeah.
How about you, like why do you have to look at, like, why can't you kind of turn the page a little bit and be like, oh, that's interesting. I wonder why can't I tolerate that? Why can't I handle that?
Exactly.
And also keep in mind the context of these folks, right? It's generally pretty just fit people doing these studies because they're college students, probably had an athletic background, probably walked to the lab, probably walked to class.
Yep. Which is why I think a lot of the fatigue boogeyman, we don't see it in research, but very clearly from a coaching perspective, that often is a consideration. And I think that's part of the reason too.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. That's a good point.
So, okay. Gym kit. So this is straps, chalk, Versagrips, all the
right shoes.
The right shoes, knee sleeves, belt, all that. Got to be S2, right?
Would you include like machines in this? Like access to certain machines?
No.
Okay. I would put it I would put it in low. No, I'd put it in high C tier.
Straps? Is that why? Which one are you thinking of?
I think it can be helpful, like having a belt to do lower body training with.
Sure.
I think can be meaningful. So I'd probably maybe put it like right before rep tempo.
Okay.
But again, rep tempo is one of those things that like no one messes up, so that's why it's so low.
Sure.
Same with sessions per week; it's kind of hard to mess up.
Sure.
Unless in extreme scenarios. But I do think if you're really trying to progress and you don't have straps, you could probably find some alternatives using different equipment, maybe. But I think at some point it's kind of required to use straps. If you have the wrong shoes, you could just train barefoot. And if you're not wearing Rascal Apparel, then what are you doing?
Not sponsored, but last one, time-saving strategies. So the antagonist paired sets.
Oh, nice. Antagonist agonist paired sets or just more generally non-overlapping paired sets. So that would be
non-overlapping supersets, whatever.
Basically, the way that I like to program these and execute them myself is, okay, try to set things up so you're doing exercises back-to-back within your session that don't overlap. So the easiest way is to do like the opposite action. So if you're doing a push, then you pair that with a pull, or you could even do it like lateral delts and calves, right? That isn't antagonist-agonist, but it's non-overlapping. That can be helpful because what you can do is you could just, do your pushing set, rest a minute, 90 seconds, and do your pulling set, rest a minute or 90 seconds, right? You don't have to sprint from one to the other, but you just kind of pair them. It ends up making training a little bit more efficient because you really just catch your breath, and then while you're doing your rows, your chest is recovering, that sort of thing. I kind of bake that into the rest periods a little bit, so I would put an A tier for agonist, antagonist right before rest periods. Are there other time-saving strategies you had in mind?
Not really. That's it's kind of, that's why I didn't put it in there. It was relatively it's kind of a monolithic thing.
Yeah, it doesn't actually have an effect on the training. So there's nothing magic about the non-overlapping superset. But to me, there's no reason not to do it. Yeah. So the way that I like to set up my training is most things are set up, except for heavy lower body compounds. Most things are set up to be paired.
You could do that.
I could do it. That's how I do it. But my general approach is let's say I'm doing bench press and lat pull downs. I'm going to put my equipment on the bench press. I got the bench press right now. But I'm not going to also put my equipment on the lat pull down and take up two pieces of equipment. I'll hang out of the bench press. When I finish my bench press, I finish my rest. I'll walk over to lat pull down. If no one's using it, I'll hit a set. If someone is using it, then okay, fine, I'll just get those sets in later, even if that means not doing paired sets. Yeah. It doesn't actually change performance. It doesn't change the effectiveness. It just makes training more efficient. So I'm putting in A tier because it's there's really no downside unless you just hate it, which to me it's way more enjoyable to train that way. Other time-saving strategies would be in intensity techniques, but we already talked about those.
Exactly. Cool. Okay. So with all that in mind, I guess the first question would be, in terms of periodization for hypertrophy, which of these variables are kind of on the table for you when you're kind of thinking about that? And if you had to put forward, do you think periodization is worth messing with preemptively for hypertrophy? And if you had to, how would you design it with these variables in mind?
Yeah, so right now it's low B tier, right?
Yeah.
Which
again is kind of periodization is a hard one to place because I still think it literally encompasses all these variables. It's just the change of them. So whether that's even good to put on the list is arguable. But yeah, I guess. So just to give the quick spiel, people often say that periodization is not necessary for hypertrophy. However, on closer inspection of those studies, basically none of them are designed with hypertrophy in mind.
The periodization studies.
Yeah, they're pretty much all designed with strength in mind. So the question kind of to me is still pretty outstanding on is some change in training variables beneficial for hypertrophy? If so, which ones? That's kind of the way that I view it.
Yeah, that's a good question. Regarding the research in general, not only are some of the studies kind of designed with strength as the primary outcome, but also there's just so many ways to look at periodization, to your point, right? Technically, a Deloads study is a periodization study. You could have linear periodization where the experimental group, the group using periodization, increases load and decreases rep range throughout the study. You could have reverse linear periodization where the opposite occurs. The experimental group increases rep range, decreases load, relative load throughout the study. You could have a mix of those. You could have block periodization. You could have infinite ways to program block periodization. You could have undulating periodization in there. You could have, what else am I missing? There's definitely things I'm missing, right? There's even a good narrative paper, and I can't think of the author off the top of my head, but the title is something to the effect of, is periodization really just variation? Because I think that's an important distinction in the sense that, some research will claim to look at, or even some textbooks, like strength and conditioning textbooks, will claim that this is periodization, but the case made in that paper is that, it's really just variation in the training stimulus, and the independent effects of variation would be different from the independent effects of periodization. And I tend to agree with that. So to me, when we think about periodization, just to define our terms here, is some sort of proactive manipulation of the magnitude of the stimulus and or the type of stimulus, does that have an independent physiological effect that may enhance hypertrophy? And for now, let's put that as beyond the potential practical effects. Let's also put that beyond the potential effects of just variation. So again, an example of variation would be, I didn't train rear delts directly last block. Now I'm going to do it this block just to vary it up a little bit to kind of cover my bases. Or I'm going to also do some cardio this block and add some variation to make sure my cardiorespiratory system is not declining as rapidly as it otherwise would be, or maybe even improving. Short answer is I don't think I have the evidence to say that periodization within those constraints I just outlined is a thing that would benefit hypertrophy. So to me, that's the null hypothesis. That is kind of the operating ground that I'm working from. Is it's probably not top of mind. So it's definitely not S or A tier. It's not going to be something I'm thinking of or planning out quite as much as those variables above it. But I do think it could have a neutral to positive effect in some cases, especially when you layer on the potential benefits of variation and the potential benefits of like some of those practical things like just enjoyment with training, client engagement, or just, something to keep things interesting. So that's where I'm at with it. I do think it's really here's a big thing that I think people get wrong in the evidence-based sphere, not only in our field, but just in general, is that they'll say, okay, there's no evidence to support this. In this case, there's no evidence to support the efficacy, or at least there's not strong evidence to support the efficacy of periodization for hypertrophy. Therefore, periodization for hypertrophy doesn't work, and you shouldn't consider it. I think that is the wrong way to think about it. Instead, you can say there is no clear evidence for hypertrophy or for periodization enhancing hypertrophy. Therefore, actually, let me take a step back. There is no clear evidence for periodization enhancing hypertrophy, but the research investigating periodization for hypertrophy isn't exhaustive and might not be designed in the way that we would need to actually get a clear look.
Just a lower tier consideration, ultimately.
Therefore, I think the correct way to interpret that is therefore, we don't know.
Yeah.
I think that's important to say. Is like you might hear that soundbite if periodization doesn't matter for hypertrophy. I would just say we don't know if periodization matters for hypertrophy.
Yeah.
I would say based on anecdotes, based on the principles we can gain from research, it's like you said, it's a lower tier variable. So I do feel pretty good about it being like low B tier. Mm-hmm. Another thing that I think kind of falls into that periodization bucket is, and I mentioned this before, that kind of like nutritional strategies, lifestyle would be like SS tier, because if those aren't in place and you're, not adhering to a general calorie range, not to say you have to track everything to the gram, then a lot of these things kind of aren't really gonna do their job. But like something that I am thinking now that I'm kind of talking through this is strategically mapping out nutritional strategies and slightly adjusting the training as a result of the current nutritional strategy, I think can be quite helpful. But again, within the definition of periodization I gave, that's more of a practical thing.
Yeah. The thing that comes to mind to me that makes this kind of a different question than you may think intuitively is that the way at which strength and hypertrophy operate are just fundamentally different. So somewhat implied in the term periodization, at least historically, is that you're training for an event. That is kind of the point. Is like if I'm periodizing my training for strength, you're assuming at the end of the cycle, at some point, you're going to test the strength. But for hypertrophy, I view it much more like a cumulative outcome. So instead of designing training so that I'm the strongest on a given day, what you're doing for hypertrophy is you're designing training so that you're accumulating the greatest amount of high quality training dose over 10 years. So it's just like a fundamentally different optimization problem that you're dealing with. And so I think I don't even know how you would really investigate that. To me, that's almost self-evident. Right? Over the course of 10 years, you're going to have some strategies that allow you to maintain your training quality or maintain work through injuries and things like that. So that is more of a practical consideration, but like I kind of think that's what periodization is for hypertrophy, because the problem that you're trying to optimize for is just fundamentally different, right? Like, is keeping the exact same training program for 10 years probably the most sustainable? Probably not, right? Like, you're going to want some variation in there, whether that's for psychological monotony reasons.
Even just an infrequent deload.
Infrequent deload, whether that's changing the, like a program necessitates priorities within each session. You have 6 sessions to have an opportunity for an exercise to go first. That's a component of it, right? If we agree that exercise order matters, that's a component of the periodization that you could probably have. Workloads going to different areas, all these kind of things. Like, do I think that's ever going to make a massive difference in a 12-week study? Probably not. And so I do think it is a lower tier consideration, but like, periodization for hypertrophy is just like a fundamentally different issue to me than it is something like for strength or for power or like competition performance in some way. Does that make sense?
No, I think it makes total sense. I think we've both acknowledged the fact that the definition of periodization can be quite broad, and it can encompass just these practical things: deloads, variation, getting, if you're a competitive bodybuilder, getting feedback from judges, or you get the leanest you've ever had been, you get feedback from your coach about what you need to bring up. Shout out to my boy Seth. He served that role for me, and he was like, dude, the vas lateralis got to come up. And I was like, all right, we're done with low bar squats for a while. That like kind of falls within periodization. But I think what's interesting, at least to me, and hopefully this is to you and the listener, is that narrower definition of periodization and kind of workshopping some ideas there. And on the front end, we're just going to say it. There isn't anything research-wise here. And I think the narrow definition of periodization that I outlined before, probably an easy way to explain it is like using different training phases to target different qualities in like a meaningfully biased manner. So like, in other words, okay, right now, most people just do a mesocycle, checks all the boxes for a good hypertrophy program. Maybe they do a deload, maybe they do an intro week, maybe they do both, and then they go into the next one, right? And maybe they make some changes based on how things were grooving in the last block, or maybe they make some slight changes based on where they're at in their diet phase. Cool. Again, probably falls under periodization, but let's think about these more training phase, this narrower definition of periodization. So let's workshop some examples so this hopefully resonates with the listener. When I was on Revive Stronger a few months ago, we were talking about resensitization, and they used to be, and I think Renaissance periodization used to kind of be into these like primer phases where you would do, don't quote me on this, but I think lower rep work on average, lower volume for 3-4 weeks, something like that, to kind of resensitize the muscle to subsequent training. So it's kind of priming training to come. So that would be an approach, is like a strength block or a low volume block or a primer phase. Another one would be like a either local and or systemic work capacity or conditioning phase, right? So local being, how do I improve the efficiency of delivering the stuff that needs to go to the working skeletal muscle to better sustain my performance for longer within a session, right? So you could imagine how that would look in terms of like shorter rest period work, maybe shorter muscle lengths, things like that. Or you could also do work capacity from a more systemic perspective, or probably more broadly, just more cardiovascular type training, right? Mm-hmm. How do I improve the efficiency of the cardiovascular system to subsequently benefit performance or benefit recovery or benefit adaptation somehow for subsequent bread and butter hypertrophy training? Those are the ones that come to mind for me. Are there any others that come to mind for you?
I think that's exactly, it's like essentially just
lower rep or higher rep work.
Yeah, I mean, if you really want to simplify, that's what it kind of comes down to for people to resonate
deloads.
It. Yeah, it's the other thing would be, I don't know if you consider like do you consider like specialization as, no, you don't consider that as periodization?
Shoot.
Because that's kind of the way that I think about it, is like for a calendar year.
I did have like 18 months of my coaching where I did lean into that quite a bit because I was pretty fired up about it. Now I think it does fall within our definition.
Yeah.
But it is kind of different in nature from
Yeah,
the ones
it is. It's
so
not,
maybe let's start with those ones.
Sure.
And then we'll go to specialization.
I think the more standard ones that you mentioned, exactly what I think of, is essentially the higher to lower rep continuum, but essentially that's proxying the metabolic events that are underneath the hood, kind of.
Yeah.
Or the
or lack thereof in a way.
Yeah. That's kind of what I mean. It's like
energy systems.
Yeah, energy systems or the
biasing of energy systems,
local muscular mechanisms, whatever you want to say. Yeah.
How about like different cycling between like different muscle lengths, bias of muscle lengths?
Yeah, I mean that's
to me that's more like variation though.
Yeah, it's so hard, right? Because like I guess the way that I'm viewing it is like, you can't really pack all those things into one program. That's where I'm saying it's like
that's variation.
It's like I know, but I'm just saying it's like a fundamentally different. It's a fundamentally different issue compared to strength.
Okay, so let's get narrow with this because gosh, periodization is so hard to discuss. So I think we would be on the same page that there is some threshold of local and systemic work capacity and efficiency of those systems, cardiovascular system, and also some of the local muscular adaptations beyond hypertrophy. That actually, let's start with a question.
I have a good way to frame it. Okay, take everything off the table. The only thing we care about right now is maximizing biceps hypertrophy. That's it. Okay? How would you design training to maximize that goal with these kind of things in mind? To me, that's where like specialization kind of gets thrown out the window. Exercise order gets thrown out the window because we're only talking about the biceps. So basically, we're asking, does sequencing the biceps training with different focuses in a certain way, does that outperform, just standard hypertrophy training all the time? That's essentially the question you're asking. To me, that's like the best way to isolate what we're trying to get at. Does that make sense?
It makes total sense.
It's just hard to think about. Yeah.
It's honestly, I kind of feel like, if I'm being honest, I kind of feel like I'm being exposed right now because that is the best way to think about that. And in a way, it's not how I think about it in practice.
Sure.
Because that's, again, look at the tier list. That's pretty low on what you're thinking about, right?
Yep.
You're thinking about lifestyle things. You're thinking about high-level structure, thinking about quality of stimulus, thinking about magnitude of stimulus, where it's placed, and then you're thinking about like periodization thereof. I mean, I do vary rep range a bit.
Mm-hmm.
Again, our coaching is, it's more hypertrophy-oriented these days compared to previously, but still, broadly speaking, it leans in the strength powerlifting side of things.
Sure.
And accessories, including arm stuff or including biceps, do tend to be periodized because I think it's a neutral to positive effect, but it's still within a relatively narrow band of like, okay.
It's not optimized for that outcome.
It's not optimized for that.
It's a let's do this because I don't see a strong reason for this. Like
neutral to positive.
Yeah, it's neutral to positive, but it's not.
But I definitely would not put my money on it being better compared to just doing the same rep range for the same period of time.
Exactly. Particularly if you're doing a double progression with a relatively wide rep range.
So let's talk about like nature. Let's even narrow that further. Okay. So your thought experiment about biceps over, let's say, a year. Mm-hmm. You're only training biceps.
Maybe shift it to quads so that the systemic part of it's maybe a little bit more of a thing. Shift it to quads.
Let's go biceps.
Okay, biceps. Okay.
Let's go biceps because I'm so far down this in my head.
Sure.
We're going biceps and we're going calendar year, and let's start by saying you're just doing one exercise. Okay.
The most practically relevant, but this is important. This is a good way to think about it.
This is how our brains think. Is like, is this how the average coach or personal trainer should think? Hell no.
No. This is how you build it up, though.
This is how you build it up, though. That's right. Are you going to change the nature of the protocol over time, over that calendar year, in terms of the frequency? Mm-hmm. The number of sets you're doing, the proximity to failure, the rest periods, rep range, if I didn't say that one, intensity techniques. Mm-hmm. Is there any benefit to varying those in some way over the calendar year compared to just doing the same rep range,
and I think
same volume?
The fundamental question to answer that is to say, is there some process of hypertrophy that is going to diminish disproportionately, I guess is the way that I think about it. So like comparing this to strength, the assumption for strength is that the training that lets you express the thing you want to express is not the same training that would help you develop what needs to be developed in order to express what you want to express. That's the assumption. And so that's
But what are you expressing with hypertrophy training?
That's what I'm saying. That's the disconnect.
Oh, yeah.
Is that
it's not a
for
performance
strength,
outcome.
it's extremely
It's a
clear.
It's a girth outcome. it's a girth.
For strength, it's an extremely clear indication why periodization at least would be conceptually helpful. But for hypertrophy, the assumption that you're making is that in order to express hypertrophy, which is essentially the development of muscle tissue.
Nah, bro, you ain't expressing hypertrophy.
Well, that's what I'm saying. It's the concept doesn't even really make sense because you're developing muscle size in order to develop muscle size. It's like tautological in a way.
Or you're no, to me you're developing.
Like you could break
you're
it down.
You're probably
to
growing the whole time if you're consistent with it. Lifestyle factors are in place, but to me it almost necessitates. No, I see what you're saying now. Okay, I see what
it's
you mean.
tautological in a way. Like you could go back a layer and say, okay, we develop anaerobic metabolism to allow mechanical tension to be applied for a longer period of time throughout the set. Or you could like break it up into the sub-mechanisms, and then you basically move things down a layer to say that hypertrophy is the thing that we're expressing now. But I have.
Can you just answer my damn question?
What did you say? I didn't even know what you asked.
It was. I should not be the one saying that, by the way. I took 15 minutes to answer whether a variable should be in S, A, B, C, or D2. My question was, you have one bicep exercise.
Yeah.
That's all you're doing for a calendar year.
Yeah.
Is there any benefit to varying any...
My gut says no. Like
rep range, volume, like doing like volume ramping versus constant volume.
The only reason,
having some BFR training even.
The only reason you would do that, at least the way that I'm thinking about it currently, is that it would potentially increase the rate at which you're increasing muscle size so that it's perceivable in a given period of time. That's really the only reason. So like volume.
So just optimizing short-term hypertrophy.
Yeah, I guess if you really want to think about it.
To me, periodization would say that there is almost a compromise or at least some longer-term consideration that some underlying quality is going to feed forward into greater hypertrophy.
And that's what I'm saying. I don't think that like.
How about for quads, given that's like requires, like you said, more systemic factors?
That's the thing is like, okay, let's say, what would you do for pure hypertrophy training for quads? Let's just say I'm doing Smith squats, the only thing I'm doing, or leg press or hack squat or whatever. Leg extension maybe is even a better example. At some point, if all you're doing, if your whole life is dedicated to just progressing your leg extension as much as possible, you would have to imagine that systemically you would decondition a little bit. At which point
you would decondition. How
like
so?
Systemically. And so
I don't know what you mean by that.
Like you're not in shape.
Okay.
Cardiovascularly, you're fat. Like I don't know what else way to say it. So that probably would have negative implications on the amount of volume that you could tolerate, which in theory would impair short and long-term hypertrophy. So like that to me, that's the more clear one. And so the assumption you're saying there is if there is a point at which local or systemic factors are limiting your ability to tolerate and benefit from a given amount of training, that would be your best implication in my mind.
Do you think within the context of just someone that's working out 4 days a week?
That's what I don't know.
Do you think that would actually matter?
That's the question. I don't know.
Okay. So now let's use the quad example. Again, for the listener, we're just doing one exercise for a year.
Mm-hmm.
Zach is saying that there might be a benefit to some cardio, basically.
Cardio or higher reps or whatever to just get some of that theoretical local and systemic conditioning back so that you can go back to like the meat and potatoes hypertrophy work and theoretically restore your rate at which you're able to progress that or whatever.
Okay.
And then
here's the follow-up question.
Here's the last side of it. And then the other side of it is, okay, if you want to say the primer phase or whatever, let's say you're able to maximize your neuromuscular adaptations or something like that with lower rep training or whatever. Then when you go back to your meat and potatoes, is there an argument to be made there that you're able to have higher levels of motor unit recruitment, higher levels of mechanical tension for a given set? And so then ultimately, if both those things are true, which I do think they are, the more important question is, do those degrade with standard hypertrophy training? And that's the one I don't know.
Do those degrade, and do they actually matter for the hypertrophy stimulus. Those are the unknowns.
I think they'd probably almost certainly matter to some degree. It's just
a matter
how much.
It's a matter of how much, and is it a threshold effect?
Yeah.
Or is it more of like a continuum?
Yeah.
So like, man, this is making me think of some of the like OG resistance training research, which probably didn't even use direct measures of muscle size. Maybe they looked at like body weight as their outcome measure, or they looked at like arm circumference, or maybe they used like a skin fold equation for muscle mass, or maybe underwater weighing, right? Some of these older studies where they would have like previously strength trained individuals and previously endurance trained individuals and have them both train. Man, I can't think of any details off the top of my head, to be honest, but I know that that was kind of like a thing for a little bit in the field. I think if memory serves. Oh, and then there was also, I was going to say, if memory serves, like oftentimes the previously cardiovascular trained folks would benefit more from the hypertrophy training than the previously strength trained folks. But it could just be the fact that they were like at a lower starting point and less trained.
There's one study, I think it's by Thompson. The
from
single leg cycling.
Phillips lab.
Yeah, single leg cycling aerobic preconditioning. Yeah, we did a
newsletter on it. We did something on that. Hey, newsletter's coming back. I'm stoked about that. Yeah. But we did, when we were sending out pretty regular newsletters, we did one on that, and it was basically cycling training.
Single leg cycling, yeah.
And I think they took biopsies of the quads. Yeah. Okay, we see some local muscular adaptations that improve local conditioning. That seemed to slightly enhance the subsequent hypertrophy training. Yeah. To me, the question is, could you have just gotten those adaptations from just lifting, right? So, like, I think what we're saying right now is, like, there's probably some benefit to having these underlying characteristics, right? Those underlying characteristics largely come down to work capacity. You could maybe make a case for like some of the more strength-oriented ones as well, regarding ability to have
just neuromuscular efficiency at the end of the day. Like
neuromuscular efficiency. Yeah. I'm very careful with my words regarding all the motor unit stuff. Yeah. Because I know that you can easily jumble your words there. But yeah. Efficiency of the nervous system to send the signals to the motor units and therefore the muscle fibers that are probably arguably the ones we care more about for long-term.
Which I still want to look into that. That's like this one outstanding belief that, you know, I started picking up and saying, and it makes sense, but like I just
someday I'll tell the stories of when I was on my I was doing all my interviews for PhD schools and some of the feedback I got on that from different labs because that was on my mind at the time. Yeah. And, you know, when you do a PhD interview, you kind of just talk shop about research, which is fun. Yeah. And some cuss words were shared regarding the propensity of growth between different fiber phenotypes. Yeah.
Interesting.
Where the hell was I going with that?
I don't know.
What was I talking about before? Oh, okay. So we're largely on this. Here's what I was gonna. Okay. We're largely on the same page with. There's probably some benefit there to be had, right? Even if it's just in terms of your ability to tolerate the workload, maybe recover between sessions, something like that. Yeah. Or recruit and provide maximal tension to the fibers and the higher threshold end of the spectrum. Regarding periodization, is there any benefit to doing that in a phased, so targeting those adaptations in a phased way or a concurrent way? So concurrent periodization would be like, okay, I'm doing those things, but I'm just covering my bases at all times. Yeah. So I always kind of have some cardio in just to like, you know, make sure I'm addressing that, right? Whereas more like block periodization or phase-based periodization would say, okay, I'm probably doing everything at the same time, but I'm shifting the bias more seriously, right? I think I'm going to have a phase where I do more cardio, I do more higher rep stuff, maybe shorter rest period to kind of target these adaptations. Sure, I still have some bread and butter hypertrophy work, but it changes quite a bit at times.
Yeah. Similar to strength, I think there's probably two ways to attack it. First, I think to some degree, specificity still always comes to mind with this. Like for me, like you absolutely can train these things concurrently, but I still feel like the net gain in any one quality is going to be worse because some of them are like completely divergent.
This makes me think of the DUP. Like
Yeah.
honestly,
Yeah.
like I don't think we have enough evidence to say that like doing your more strength oriented work versus your more power or hypertrophy oriented work or whatever in separate versus the same session. I don't think we have like a ton of evidence there, but I think there is a reason why people have split those up.
Yeah.
At least a little bit.
Yeah. I mean, even just for like
For powerlifters.
Powerlifting periodization, like that's the where my head goes. Like the training that is required to maximize like all the neuromuscular qualities you're kind of targeting, like is distinctly different to that. That's going to progress the metabolic properties like that in a work capacity phase. So like, yes, you could do those things concurrently. That probably would have some distinct benefits, but like mechanistically, like the AKT switch, for example, is like kind of, it's kind of binary to some degree. Obviously, that's a gross oversimplification of the mechanistic pathways, but like to some degree, it's like specificity is kind of like at odds with one another in that regard. And I feel like to some degree, the hypertrophy example is similar. Like, yes, if I'm including, very high rep, low rest period training to like try to keep up my systemic and local conditioning, and then I also have some really heavy work in there to try to maintain my neuromuscular efficiency or whatever, those absolutely can probably positively contribute to both those adaptations, but they are kind of polar opposites at the same time.
So you're making the case that some degree of phase or block approach might be beneficial, but what if you just did it on like had that bias on different days within the week?
Yeah, I don't know.
That's the other case.
I get that. I still feel like seems a little bit short term.
There is something in my mind. I don't know if there's anything physiological here about rowing the boat in the same direction.
Yeah.
Like everyone rowing the boat in the same direction.
Yeah. Ultimately, the thing to me, like to like have the if then statement to like evaluate this question, to me, it's ultimately if one of those approaches allows you to tolerate more high quality volume in like the sweet meat and potatoes direction, and your progression thereof is improved in some way. But that progression part of it was an outstanding question. But if that occurs, theoretically seems positive to me. That's kind of the where I'm at.
I agree that is probably the base that we should work from when thinking about periodization right now as it stands, in the sense that like you should really think about periodization. We're down this rabbit hole of maybe physiological rationale independent of all the practical stuff. I agree with you. I think periodization should largely come from the perspective of maximizing the quality workload over a very long period of time. And again, in the short term, or that could manifest in low volumes per week, right? At the same time, though, where I'm really interested in the periodization for hypertrophy thing is like, sure, some of these periodization approaches could enhance your ability to maximize work under the curve. I agree. But is there a way to develop a quality so that the same work
same stat
is more effective?
Yeah, I mean, if you think that, so I guess put another way, theoretically the physiological abilities that are going to allow you to tolerate more work could be removing the slight inhibitions that result in diminishing returns within a session. So
rephrase.
Yeah, said another way. Let's say I'm doing 4 sets per session for a given muscle group, and that's kind of where I feel like I'm tapping out. That doesn't just like break off, right? Like that's a gradual thing where it's like, okay, I probably can't tolerate 4.6 sets, so I can't do 5 kind of thing, but I can tolerate 4. And that's probably like a gradual diminishing returns relationship. If I'm removing the limiters that allow me to tolerate more per session volume, in theory, I can probably get more out of the sets that I am doing because those limiters are being removed, I guess is the way that I'm thinking about it. Is like those.
Give me an example of a limiter.
Let's just say that your systemic conditioning is poor and you improve that, and now central fatigue mechanisms are somewhat eliminated to the extent that you can get more.
They're attenuated, so your performance improves.
Your performance improves, or the actual ability to deliver a full signal to the muscle is maintain throughout more of the session.
Yeah.
So like you're training you're training more fibers theoretically. Is like if
for longer.
Yeah, in that session. And then similarly, if I'm able to kind of increase the intensity of the signal that I'm sending to the muscle through the other end of the spectrum, then maybe that allows me to deliver more of a stimulus in those first couple sets.
Yeah, I've always
this is okay. So far in like the hypothetical. We don't.
I do think
I'm
mentioned
like convincing myself.
You mentioned mechanisms versus outcomes before, and kind of how those really shouldn't be viewed in isolation. I think this is a good example because, like, to me, maybe the best way to like having a very clear understanding of what limits you at the end of a set mechanistically can inform the potential rationale of what you were just saying.
Yeah.
Because like there is a case or there is an argument to be made that the muscle itself still has some juice in the tank, some gas in the tank, but it's really just you're reaching a threshold of perception of effort. There's also a case directly counter to that. I would have to imagine it's kind of context dependent in terms of training status, novelty of the exercise, maybe even like social environment, etc. Rep range, things like that. But having more information on that could help you kind of build up these periodization models. But then you obviously want to test the periodization model with enough statistical power and a long enough study, and then you get 2 studies on it, and they're inconclusive because all studies in our field are inconclusive, and then you're like, shoot, what do we do? Yeah. But yeah, I will say I kind of, in a way, am skeptical of the premise about like some heavier work improving your ability to benefit from moderate rep range work, because strength is quite rep range specific. So like if you are hanging out in the 10 to 12 rep range and then you do sets of 4 to 6 for a while.
I don't think that's what matters though.
Oh, okay. So you agree that like your performance of sets of 10 to 12 wouldn't necessarily increase faster.
Yeah. I guess I think about it more on like a neuromuscular level is like
but then how would your... Okay, go ahead.
Your maximal force production is kind of like to some degree indicative of your ability to like recruit, a higher percentage of the motor unit pool or whatever. And theoretically that would result in benefits to your higher we talked about this one day. I'm getting deja vu right now. That would theoretically benefit your moderate rep range performance, but the difference is there's multiple things that go into your multiple rep range performance. The farther you get down the rep spectrum, it's not just your maximal strength that starts to matter. Now you have your local conditioning, systemic conditioning. So even if that individual vector is positive, the overall vector could remain unaltered because you're systemic, and you know what I mean?
And okay, now circling back, this is why I had logbook high, but not like first, and also why, again, I hate everything about that tier list. I think like I'm kind of skeptical of where it is in terms of how high it is, because there are a lot of things that could lead to like the same performance, but like that doesn't mean the stimulus is worse or that like your training hasn't been effective.
Yeah.
Because, as we'll talk about probably in the next episode, like just that relationship between performance and strength and hypertrophy is quite complex.
Yeah.
And just saying, oh, I got stronger on this exercise, therefore I'm bigger, is not the end-all be-all. Yeah. I think the logbooking is helpful for more practical things and longer time scales to make sure you're at least directionally moving in the way you want to go. Okay. So we kind of went down the rabbit hole of different blocks, right? Or like different underlying qualities. And let me try to, targeting different underlying qualities in a periodization scheme for the sake of improving underlying qualities so that it either improves your ability to handle workload or it makes a given workload makes a given workload more effective later on. Let me try to summarize and we'll go from there.
Sure.
The summary is that you very well might do that for practical reasons, such as...
I think you almost certainly periodize training for hypertrophy for practical reasons. Like that's almost like a given.
Oh, you think everyone should periodize?
Because like again, you just come back to like the biggest thing that I think about is like if I have 4 sessions in a week, there are 4 exercises that are first, and that necessitates certain muscle groups being prioritized.
No. Okay, you're getting too broad with periodization. I'm still just talking about like different blocks or different phases targeting the strength and like basically different qualities.
Okay, yeah, no, then maybe that's not necessarily implied.
Yeah.
Not necessarily implied. Sorry.
Yeah. So periodization. This is why everyone talks past each other with periodization, because it's so broad. Dude, we should come up with different terms for like each component of periodization.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll put a pin in that one. Maybe we'll workshop that later.
Yeah.
Or someone could do the work for us after listening to this. Put in the comments. Okay, so you very well might periodize training for practical reasons, but if we were to just zone in on different phases of training.
So just make sure I'm understanding. Periodizing for practical reasons would mean I'm going to do different phases to keep things fun.
Keep things fun, or just
sure.
Variation because I neglected something in the past, in the last block, and I just want to cycle it in and make sure I address it at some point, but it was impractical to do everything all at once.
How is that periodization, but what I said isn't?
No. They're both periodization. That's just very broad.
Okay.
I'm just going into a sliver of periodization in terms of like I'm going to do a work capacity phase. I'm going to do more of a strength bias phase. Or systemic versus local conditioning, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So if we were to just zoom in on that, I think what we're saying is there might be a benefit. We can't say one way or the other. What you should assess on the individual level for yourself or for your clients is, would targeting a certain quality enhance the productive work under the curve in the long term for this individual? For the most part, you can probably do that concurrently within a training week, but in extreme scenarios, or if you just want to experiment, you could do it pretty like block dependent. Yeah. But this should be very low on your priority list. And if you don't even do that at all, and you just make sure someone is generally healthy and isn't running into like apparent blocks in their training in terms of just local or systemic work capacity or just ability to express strength more broadly, then you probably don't need to worry about it, but it is something that's interesting for future research.
The way that, like, a couple practical examples of where I've used this in the past, now this has been a little bit more in like kind of the strength direction, but I think it has the same carryovers. Like, I've had a couple clients who haven't had extensive physical activity history when they've come to work with me, like they're relatively sedentary individuals growing up or whatever. Those are the cases where, like, I've seen just like they literally can't tolerate work that like every client I ever had tolerates. And you're like searching for like, okay, is it just like, are they just different, or like what's the factor here? And that seems to be the factor that's like most strongly related. I got on a big kick with like making sure all my clients were like keeping their step counts high on the weekends and stuff like that is another contributor that I find. Like just habitual step counts are like pretty indicative of these kind of things as well. But there's like multiple arrows that kind of point in a direction of somebody just like generally not being very active and not being very in shape, that I think like these kind of interventions could theoretically benefit. And that's kind of what we did, is like it was like more of like a progressive workload and progressive rep range approach to get them in shape to tolerate training.
It was kind of a short-term periodization approach, a short-term intervention to build up their work capacity, get them to a better spot, and then from there you probably moved into more of a concurrent approach where you just tried to maintain it.
Exactly.
So that's a nice model. I like that. So basically, if one of these seems to be dramatically a limiter in terms of their ability to benefit maximally from training, then you might want to do short-term interventions, and then that would be kind of more of a block periodization approach, and then move into a concurrent periodization approach with some of those elements, but just at a lower dose, more maintenance style. And then maybe for practical reasons, for fun reasons, if they're interested in it, they liked it, whatever, you could do it again. And that could also serve the variation component of periodization and just the enjoyment practical side of things.
I think two things to add on that, to directly like build on what you just said. And then I think in the long term, people's life contexts change all the time. you're going to be less active in certain times. You're going to be able to focus on training more at times. You're going to be, just training more in general sometimes. Like, I think those could manifest deficits that you may want to recover with some of these strategies in theory. But the other thing I was going to say is, like, and then to paint it on the other side of the picture, there's just like a different type of like grinding you get when you're like well experienced with like just a wider variety of training. I don't know if you like
just exercise.
Yeah, like some coaches will like think it's important to like do the barbell lifts, for example. I don't think that's necessarily the case, but like
I appreciate the perspective.
Yeah, there's like some general strength skill that you get from just having done heavy lifting. I think
general hard training skill.
Yeah, and I think that can also be a thing that like people can gain. I'm just saying that's an example on the other end of the spectrum that's like similar to the people being out of shape.
Yeah, at this point in my life, I had some lifting experience, but it wasn't like that great. But kind of when I initially got into training in general was like with a strength and conditioning coach that I had to help me with basketball. So I would just go a couple times a week to this strength and conditioning facility, probably like 3 times a week. That's really where I fell in love with training. And it makes me think of some of the things we did. In hindsight, I look back and I'm like, on paper, maybe not like the best way to train the qualities I needed as an athlete. But it just taught me to train hard, and the feeling of just like completing that and the camaraderie around it, I think really made me fall in love with training. And the example that always comes to mind is, keep in mind, I'm like 6'2", 6'3". And there was this really low box. This is maybe like, I don't know, 6 inches off the ground. And there were a bunch of bands around it. So I would have to go awkwardly get down to the bottom of the box. The strength coach would put all the bands over my shoulders, and I'd have to like hold them right here. And I would do squat jumps, right? And it was like sets of like 100, right? And then once I could no longer jump, I would just stand up and try to jump, but wouldn't actually get up. And then eventually you can't actually
failure with plyometrics.
You can't actually stand up, so you're kind of doing like partials. And then once you like can't stand up off the box, he takes a band off, you do it again. And that would be like the finisher a couple times a week. And and just like I dreaded that so much. I loved it so much. And those are just examples of like, I'm not saying I have like the ideal training background to know how to train hard there. I think everyone has room for improvement there. But like those sorts of experiences of just like, even if they're not optimal, they're not ideal, just general exercise history, just training hard for the sake of training hard, I think it pays dividends.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. And I remember doing like,
you guys did was it 135 AMRAP in high school?
Oh yeah, 135 wave squats is what they were called. A wave squat was an explosive downward eccentric to the point where you arguably like broke your tailbone on a small box.
Yeah.
But you use that momentum to get up, and then at the top of the squat you do a calf raise. So we did those max reps in high school. That was awesome. We did
after each rep, strength coach says, "Boom!"
Oh yeah,
every rep.
So we did that. A lot of hurt tailbones from that. And then we did like wall sits for like outrageously long periods of time because these were all like competitions.
Mm-hmm.
So really ingraining good patterns about not the technique of anything but just the numbers that you're getting. So those are awesome. But yeah, no, all those things, and I think that translates to having done some like higher load training in general and just like knowing what it feels like to grind a 1RM. I think there's some
that feeling of like your back flexing under a low bar squat and like your knees shifting back and getting bent over but actually standing up with it after missing that weight 3 times in the past.
That's not a personal example.
It is, and I'm not that great of a squatter in the first place, but I think a lot of powerlifters can resonate with that. And I think that's why a lot of powerlifters do well if they transition to more hypertrophy-oriented training is because like a leg press feels like nothing or a deep high bar squat feels like nothing because they're used to.
Here's the thing too.
They're used to those
that I didn't think about more from the like neuromuscular coordination side of things. Mm-hmm. When you're under like much heavier loads, it's essentially challenging your positioning every single rep. Mm-hmm. And powerlifters who are training 1RMs are going to be much more accustomed to like trying to maintain technique, while every single thing in the lift wants you to not do that like technique. So like when you go to hypertrophy training, obviously machines make this a little bit more easy or a little bit easier, but like certain lifts, like your body is trying to find the most mechanically advantageous position to be in, which is usually not fatiguing the muscle that you're trying to fatigue. And so having like a really good neuromuscular background in terms of like some heavy load training theoretically could like help you with that coordination through fatigue in theory too.
There's other ways to get that, but it tends to work out pretty well. Okay, so last thing to talk about with periodization, kind of we talked about this sliver of phase-oriented stuff. Concurrent versus block in terms of like those underlying adaptations. The next sliver that you mentioned is specialization. And I think this one is a little bit easier to conceptualize because it would just mean, okay, for the next 6, 12, 18, 24 weeks, we're going to do arm specialization. Everything else is still going to be trained, but maybe less so. Maybe total training is the same, but we're just going to bump up your arm volume by 50, 70%, whatever. And then after that, we're going to choose something else. We're going to do quads and hamstrings or whatever. Pick your poison. It doesn't really matter, but the idea is that you are varying between what's the plural of focus?
Foci?
You're rotating between 1 to 4 muscles that you're kind of specializing. Of course, you might specialize a muscle because you just care more about something. But to me, I think what is actually relevant for periodization in our discussion here is there inherent benefit to cycling through lower and higher volumes for a given muscle? So if we were to take the hamstrings, for example, if you spend some time at higher volumes and some time at lower volumes, compared to just taking the average of that and staying at the average the whole time, is one better than the other?
Man. And this comes down to like defining the outcome too. Like, is one better in a certain period of time? Is one going to lead you to a greater peak?
Let's say in a calendar year. So like,
man.
let's say approach A is doing 10 sets for hamstrings the entire time. Approach B is doing 20 sets for a third of the year. And then whatever you would need for the first and second third, first and last third to get to an average of 10, which off the top of my head, I have a number in mind, but I'm not going to say it because I don't want to do the wrong math publicly.
My gut reaction is it would be the same, but then I question myself and I'm like, okay, the lower end of the volume probably isn't going to lose muscle, at least precipitously. Yeah, I don't know. It's hard. My gut goes towards, like, practically, I just think, like, specialization is definitely the way to go. I just think people like having goals, like having short-term goals. I think it leads to more focus. I think it leads towards just, like, better engagement with hypertrophy training.
That's still within the practical elements.
I know. I was going to say, but like practically, I think it's like definitely the way to go. Otherwise, if you're being totally honest, hypertrophy training is pretty boring. Like it's, you keep things relatively similar. You might have some exercise.
Some people dig that though.
No, for sure. I mean, coming from a strength background where things vary a bit more, maybe that's my bias, but overall, like it's relatively boring on paper. Specialization gives you kind of a short-term goal to shoot for, which strength training kind of has that inherently. And I think it makes it a little bit more similar in that way. But that's a practical consideration. It's not really a
physiological.
So
physiologically, you say no strong leaning.
The only thing I guess kind of borders on the line of practical and physiological is like, let's say there is a systemic number of sets that you can recover from in a given week, and there are local number of sets that you can benefit from per each muscle. If the calculus doesn't work out there that you're able to train all your muscle groups that you care about at like a maximal rate, then specialization, which to me is like prioritizing some things and bringing other things down, otherwise it's just higher volumes, then that kind of is a necessity to progress certain things at an optimal rate is the way that I view it. but I don't know if either of those premises are actually true.
Yeah, I don't think
so-
they're true often.
Yeah.
Is that your hunch as well?
Yeah, I mean, probably not. Like it's
I also
something I
think-
haven't thought a ton
I
about because
also-
it's such a clear practical
I
thing.
I,
for
honest,
me,
I
but-
honestly think the argument is just as strong for the case of a constant volume being more effective, because if you just think of diminishing returns, right?
Yeah.
Like if you're doing, let's just take in isolation 10 sets versus 20 sets. All things held equal, it does seem that we would expect slightly more growth from 20 sets, but the incremental gains of going from 0 to 10 sets are greater than the incremental gains of going from 10 to 20 sets, and that difference is quite big.
Yep.
So if you are getting a large return on investment for the first 10 sets all year long, and then you're spending some time going from 10 to 20 sets just to grab that smaller increment, and then now you're going down to a lower volume after that while you're prioritizing something else, yes, you're getting a high ROI, but you're missing out on still pretty high ROI to get back up to 10 sets.
Here's the tricky thing. You have to layer on the linear log growth over time. That's the biggest piece of it, is that once you layer on the fact that it's linear log, and then the thing that we don't know.
The only way that would work is if hypertrophy was a threshold sort of effect.
It is from a perceivable perspective. That's what that's what I always think about.
I don't think that matters.
I mean, I guess the thing that I'm saying is like, in order to, so every goal with hypertrophy is time bound. So ultimately, the thing you would have to be saying is that there's linear log growth over time, meaning that the actual gains, no matter what, are going to diminish strongly over time, so that any given amount of set volume is going to lead us to a decreasing absolute rate of growth. But the relative rate of growth for higher volumes is still going to be higher. We don't know if that actual difference also diminishes. We just don't know that. But the higher volumes, although considerably less efficient, might put you over the edge in terms of how perceivable the difference is. In terms of the lower volumes, maybe not.
To me, that's just an argument for higher volume in general. That's not necessarily an argument for volume cycling or specialization, because
I'd have to think about it more. But
because again, if our thought experiment is over the course of a year,
it's additive.
It's additive, right?
Yeah.
And it's not, hypertrophy is not an on or off switch, right? Even if you're losing muscle, you can still do some sort of activity or training and lose less muscle, right? So the fact that hypertrophy is a continuous outcome variable, and given diminishing returns, I think a good default is pretty consistent volumes, deloading when practically needed, and then some degree of specialization based on practical reasons, like what you want to focus on, and also to keep things enjoyable. And here's my hot take, is that I actually think probably a bigger benefit of specialization beyond the potential inherent periodization effects of cycling between higher and lower volumes over the course of different mesocycles is actually the benefits of exercise order. Because if you're going to specialize something, you're probably going to prioritize it within a session, and I think that can add up.
Yeah, I'm trying to.
You're really thinking here.
Yeah, I'm trying to articulate what I'm thinking here. The first thought I just had is like, given the diminishing returns of volume per week, almost makes me want to like sketch out totals per year.
Yeah.
With different weekly volumes.
And variations of weekly volumes, but at the same average volume, while accounting for the linear log relation, the linear log.
Well, that for sure. That's like a whole crazy project in itself. But I guess I'm just thinking about like, because you make a good point. Like the diminishing returns ultimately suggests that if we can get the same total gain with less weekly sets, if there's more weeks with that weekly set number than the higher weekly sets. So then the question is, you almost want to be doing the least weekly volume you can. Wow, this is really workshopping on the fly here.
The least weekly volume you can while still meeting the same total volume over a long time period.
Yeah. Which is not how people think about it.
No,
We've said that, but that's hitting.
Like I said, I had a little stint where I did lean quite a bit into specialization for folks, but then we started to get our results from our meta-analysis for volume, and I started just really chewing on these ideas, I was like, I kind of think it's the opposite. I kind of think it's the opposite. And again, I mentioned that volume cycling study we're doing. To me, that is, or at least the goal was to design a study to look at that concept as with as much clarity as we can. It's as with all studies, there's going to be numerous limitations.
Sorry, this is the thing that wasn't making sense in my brain. I guess I realize it now. The thing that wasn't making sense in my brain is like, okay, so how can the Ogasawara study, for example, how can that lead to the same outcome if that's the case? But when you factor in resensitization, the linear log curve is being modified. That's the component that wasn't working in my head, because when you say it without a modification of the actual growth curve in general, why would you do high volumes like that? That doesn't even really make sense. But when you think about the modifying of the actual time effect, that's the thing that makes everything.
I will say I didn't really have like muscle memory components in there. So muscle memory there seems to be two main mechanisms for that. That is the permanence or semi-permanence.
That's what specialization is relying upon.
It is exactly, that's why our study that I've mentioned a few times now is more or less a replication of Ogasawara, but instead of atrophy, the goal, fingers crossed this works out, is that muscle size is maintained.
Or minimum effective dose.
Effective dose, or at least just muscle growth is less. Because basically, in my mind, I think this was helpful to workshop. Specialization, if there is an inherent benefit of specialization, if there's no sort of resensitization or muscle memory effect, then it's actually probably counterproductive.
Yeah, it's counterproductive. Yeah.
Again, maybe some practical benefits such as exercise order, but might be counterproductive. Okay, where it might actually be effective, or it might be
volume specialization. Let's put that label on it.
Specialization.
Then we're good.
Yeah, volume specialization. Volume cycling might be worse.
Yeah.
The exception is if muscle memory is a thing. There seems to be two main mechanisms for that. The first is kind of an epigenetic memory that the muscle cell has that makes it more ready to do the process of the central dogma of biology to create new muscle proteins, to hypertrophy. The second is the permanence or semi-permanence of myonuclei, so muscle cells. Okay, so those seem to be the mechanisms underlying muscle memory in detraining studies. So the fact that, okay, I take 6 weeks off training, then I return to training, I gain muscle faster because of this muscle memory. What we don't know, or at least we have very little insight on, is whether that muscle memory thing is an on-off switch, or if it can be leveraged in kind of a dimmer switch approach based on modulating the degree of training stress. So that's why what we're studying is, okay, let's take one step back in terms of volume. Let's cut our volume to a third of what it was before, maintain or maybe still grow muscle, but just slower. And then let's return to higher volume. When we return to higher volume, do we see an accelerated rate of growth similar to Ogasawara's detraining, retraining research and some other research along those lines? So basically, does muscle memory also apply in more versus less training, or does it only apply to atrophy? Yeah. Right? So that was kind of the fundamental question we're looking at for my main dissertation project is resensitization really just regaining atrophied muscle? Yeah. That's really what it comes down to. Yeah. And the answer to that question has important implications on periodization, specialization, variety, etc., for physiological reasons. But even if we find that the answer is yes, resensitization is literally just regaining atrophied muscle, then you still might do those periodization things, but for the practical reasons we talked about. Engagement, enjoyment, managing aches and pains, etc.
Yeah, I guess I really hadn't thought about I just hadn't expanded the weekly volume stuff onto the yearly mindset, other than it obviously being you want to maximize the work under the curve. But I hadn't thought about different methods to do that, if that makes sense. Like I'd only thought about like linearly scaling the number of weekly sets that you're doing. Yeah. Right? Like that's the example I've thought of. But when you start making that a nonlinear scale and you start flip it around and do different things. It's actually worse if there's no modification of the actual rate of growth in general. That's an interesting implication.
Yeah, and I hope to get more data on attenuation of rates of growth over longer time periods.
Mm-hmm.
So obviously, ideally, you have a 10-year study and you look at hypertrophy, and training is very controlled for 10 years and you get monthly measurements. But even if we could get 5, 6, 7-month studies with frequent measurements of muscle size, you can get an idea for that attenuation of hypertrophy that we know is true, but try to model it a little bit better, try to quantify that attenuation, try to quantify those diminishing returns, because it can be at least inform the overall mental model of these factors of muscle memory, when it occurs, to what degree it occurs, attenuation of hypertrophy that we know occurs as you become more trained, the short-term dose-response relationship of volume and hypertrophy, and kind of putting all those together. And then, once you have those three together, you can layer in that can kind of be the basis for the practical things. And maybe at times you say, screw that, not really relevant here, because what matters is this client's enjoyment and engagement. But if it's within those constraints, okay.
Yeah.
Well, also, once you get that information, you can determine the magnitude to which some of these things matter, and then play with the practical side of things, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. It's good. I hadn't really thought about it from that angle.
So I'm gonna try to summarize periodization for hypertrophy.
Let's go.
So I'm gonna go with periodization broadly and periodization narrowly. Periodization narrowly would basically say is some sort of strategic manipulation of dosage and or the nature of the dosage over a pretty long time period. So I'm not really talking about like week to week slight changes in volume, but block to block, that sort of thing, or just having meaningfully targeted training towards some underlying adaptation that isn't directly hypertrophy, with the goal of optimizing hypertrophy in a longer time scale. There's two main ways to do that. The first is to kind of have dedicated blocks or phases oriented towards local or systemic capacity, or some sort of like strength expression sort of thing. Or maybe there's another one we're not thinking of, or like a primer phase. The other way to do that would be to strategically manipulate volumes of certain muscles to potentially leverage that resensitization effect. That, to me, is periodization narrowly. In terms of applying periodization narrowly right now, my suggestion is to not get caught up in it at all unless there's a clear bottleneck in something, okay? A clear bottleneck would be like the example you gave, where someone clearly is just not in good enough shape from a local work capacity or a systemic work capacity perspective, or you're just like, man, something about this isn't working out in terms of their ability to push themselves with heavy weights, even in the 8 to 12 rep range. So we're going to try a dedicated phase, 6, 12, 18 weeks, whatever, where we're really targeting that adaptation so that their hypertrophy training can improve later on. Then, if it does improve, awesome, that's a good indication it worked. We're just going to kind of maintain that going forward and kind of have a concurrent training approach. On the specialization side of things, probably doesn't make a lot of sense to go out of your way to do that from just a physiological perspective. Okay, so the application for kind of that narrow definition of periodization for hypertrophy, the application is quite rare and probably not something to get worked up about. But hopefully our discussion on it and workshopping of it was interesting, and stay tuned for some coming research regarding some additional layers we can add on to that. Now, periodization more broadly would be the practical application of some of those things, right? That would be deloading because of just kind of to feel refreshed physically and physically and psychologically. That would be specializing different muscles within reason and kind of cycling through them based on judges' feedback, based on preferences, based on just having a fun time.
Time restrictions, too, is the biggest one.
Time restrictions, yeah. Just in a lot of ways to keep training enjoyable, right? or they like doing those work capacity type phases or strength type phases because they used to be a power lifter. Now they're training for hypertrophy and they just want to do some sort of periodization approach. That, again, that would fall under periodization more broadly, but it's more practical. Another example is, okay, we didn't really tick all of our boxes in the last mesocycle just because something kind of has to give. So we're going to kind of add variation, and that variation is going to kind of present like periodization within our broader definition of periodization, but it's really, again, more of a practical thing that kind of seems like training is varying from a high level, but it's, again, more under this broad practical definition of periodization. So TL really narrowed takeaway is that most periodization for hypertrophy should be practical in nature. And fancy models of periodization aiming different qualities, ultimately in the goal of maximizing hypertrophy, are interesting. I would definitely respect anyone that came up with a model and was convinced of it, and I'd be very interested in it. But as it stands right now, especially with my scientist hat on and also with my coach hat on, of just, again, that not really seeming to be a very common bottleneck of some of those underlying...
Do you think it's worse?
...qualities? Potentially, yeah.
Okay.
Potentially.
Particularly the weirder it gets, right?
Like the weirder it gets. If you said having some cardio in or having some high rep stuff or having some short rest period stuff just to kind of keep someone in shape, I'd say that's very unlikely to be worse. And probably
so maybe if you're going to go that route, keep it relatively modest in the shifts.
Yeah.
I agree.
So that's where I'm at. What do you think of that synopsis?
I completely agree. I think, periodization narrowly in terms of the way that we were kind of discussing it, I don't think has a ton of direct evidence behind it. Of course, that's only one part of the equation. You have to consider the fact that we really don't think there's any good direct evidence that's examined it in the first place, so that you don't really have any points in either kind of column there. So then we're kind of left on, theoretical principles and theoretical mechanisms that we can speculate on and we can think are interesting, but then we just kind of have to rely on the things that we have the most direct evidence for. And I don't think that this would fall in that category as of now. Still pretty interesting in the time being if you want to experiment with it. Keep the shifts and kind of the experimental manipulations relatively modest from kind of the home base of what we think is relatively effective training. But I am always in favor of people kind of messing around with stuff, trying things, particularly if there's a strong indication for a given client based on their background. That's kind of a blind spot for the research that doesn't have that demographic, for example, that presents a given issue. I think that's where this stuff can be potentially scooted up the list of importance. If that makes sense. Yeah.
And then the tier list synopsis is, it all sucks. I hate it all.
You have a terribly non-normal distribution.
That sucks. We definitely need to put something in D tier. It's really pissed me off that there's nothing in D tier. But I think that ship has sailed. The tier list synopsis is that the things that really are going to permit progress aren't on that tier list. So kind of like S plus tier are
lifestyle variables.
Yeah. That's not to say if you're busy you can't make progress, but instead there's those are sliding scales in terms of adherence to them. Like if you can't adhere to maintaining body weight when the goal is to maintain your body weight, it's going to be hard to kind of stick to the plan.
The example I always like to give with that is like you're playing chess, and then your external variables kind of determine how many pieces you start with. And if your external variables are really bad, doesn't mean you can't win.
Yeah, I don't know much about chess, but I would have to imagine if you only had a few pieces, you're kind of screwed.
It's going to be really hard. Yeah.
So get all your chess pieces on the chessboard. I have no idea if this analogy is going to work. Then from there, once you have your chess pieces on the chessboard, make sure you're focused on the most potent ones first.
Yeah.
Screw that analogy.
No, it actually works really well. The pawns are kind of, the lower tier variables, and then your back row of pieces that are having more movement options. Those are your higher tier variables.
What's an example of a back?
Your king, queen, knight.
Yeah. So your king,
bishop, rook.
All the king, queen, knight, etc. Those are the quality of the stimulus, and those are largely found in S tier and A tier, right? Exercise selection and execution, strategic range of motion. That's not to say everything has to be like the bottom 10% of the joints range of motion, but just at least being mindful of it, some exposure to long muscle lengths, and just not sloppy execution is kind of how I think of the range of motion stuff.
Yeah.
Training close to failure, tracking things to help you stay close to failure, to keep you honest, to assess progress on a very long time scale to make sure it's moving in the right direction. Those are all things that keep you honest in terms of exercise or set quality. Okay, so those are your kings, queens, knights, whatever. Then, is there anything between those and pawns?
No.
No.
I kind of screwed you on that. I could have said some of the other ones in like a middle tier, but pawns would be the highest. The king and the queen, those are like your your
King
S
and queen
tier.
are quality.
Yeah.
Knights are your modifying the dosage
Sure.
of that quality. So that would be volume. That would be some things like exercise order. That would be things like intensity techniques even, which isn't really in dosage, but it can help you pack some into a certain period of time or a certain time constraint, I should say. And then lastly, the pawns are some of the details that are still important, right? It's hard to play chess without them. You need a reasonable rep tempo. You need a reasonable split. You need a reasonable frequency. You need reasonable sessions per week. You need to practically work within, or you need to practically leverage some elements of periodization to keep yourself or your client engaged, to make sure that tolerance is there, to make sure psychological burnout isn't occurring, sleep disruption isn't occurring from high fatigue, etc. But those are the pawns, and those are the things that you just can't really mess them up too bad. So that's it. That's the analogy.
Yeah, I like it. Yeah, you want to do any plugs? Did most of them on the front end.
So we appreciate you tuning in.
I don't know, how long was this one? Oh, 3 hours? Pretty
3
good.
hours. It's not bad.
Tier list video. Yeah, I did not imagine it was going to go that long, but
It was fun.
Yeah,
it was good.
that was good. I think these are good because there isn't a right answer. And
Yeah.
I think exposing some of that gray is good for
Yeah.
people to see. And like seeing some of the logic in terms of making those determinations that don't have a right answer, and you have to like basically put something down on paper that you think, I think exposes the fact that none of this is like something that can be like terribly screwed up.
there's a reason we're very hesitant to give like volume recommendations or RIR recommendations, because we know that we're going to probably change our mind on them, and we also know just the limitations of recommendations in general. But I think it's good at times to force ourselves to, I guess, face the dragon of this is the best we can do right now. Again, this sucks. I agree with you.
The only other thing I'd say in the comments, if you're interested in seeing any more of these types of videos, or if you have any other suggestions, to
give us ideas.
Like give these types of videos a shot. We kind of enjoy, going through things in this kind of a format where it's a little bit more think on your feet. I think it stirs good discussion, and kind of honestly, I think when we've done these, we've come to like things that we didn't really realize, or like thought about things.
We can't do a meta-analysis with 70 studies for every episode.
Yeah, exactly. So I just think these are uniquely beneficial too. Like I'll definitely walk away with this with some things to think about, and how to like best investigate that. Like my mind's going rapidly on the specialization thing and like mapping out those theoretical things long term with the with having resensitization, not having it. So yeah, there's just like a couple things I think these are uniquely beneficial for, and hopefully they're not an absolute pain to listen to. So if there's any other types of formats like this that you'd be interested in, drop us in the comments and let us know, and we'll continue to try to use stuff that's useful and go from there.
Sweet. We'll see you in the next episode.
Peace.